Social divisions and classes. The existence of social divisions is a reasonably obvious fact in any society. They involve groups of persons who regard one another as equals, but consider others to be above or beneath them. These divisions are manifested in the mutual attitudes of people to one another and also in their way of life. A much more difficult question, which is still not definitely decided, is to determine the scale of values that people employ when they regard others as equal to, higher or lower than themselves. Here the most diverse considerations may come into play: birth, calling, income, ethnic affiliation, religion, and the like. We are still not in a position to lay down precise value systems for any given society. It is also evident that the same values may play a different part in different societies, and that even in the same one they may be differently assessed at different times. Again, any society may be divided in various ways. Certain of these divisions may be of minor importance, others of major importance in the social structure referred to. As a society develops historically, the emphasis may shift, divisions dominant at one time may at others become subordinate, and vice versa. Which are dominant, and which subordinate, cannot be established on speculative grounds. It has to be settled by empirical analysis of the society in question. It is also difficult to determine how many strata there are in present-day society. The number is likely enough to vary from one country to another. Empirical inquiry suggests, at all events, that there are several levels to be reckoned with. It is impossible, moreover, to draw precise boundaries between the various strata, just as, in the spectrum, one cannot say exactly where one color begins and another ends. Now the Soviet theory of classes relies very definitely on a two-class scheme. This is not to say that in every formation there are only two classes. We have seen that auxiliary classes and intermediate divisions also receive recognition. But the auxiliary classes are either relics of the leading classes in the previous formation, or new classes, caught on the upgrade, and due to leave their mark on the formation yet to come. Nor are the intermediate strata allotted any independent function in social life. Their importance lies wholly in the fact that they can be drawn in as allies of one of the two main classes. This view derives in essentials from Marx. It would be doing him an injustice to accuse him of total blindness to the existence of other divisions in society. But he thought that, compared with the two major classes of capitalists and workers, all other divisions were either negligible, or could be reduced to these two. Now when Marx treats the divisions based on the relations of production as the decisive factor in society, the grounds for this doctrine are to be found in his philosophy of history, whereby the mode of production is the ultimate determinant of all social development. We have seen, however, that the materialist conception of history gets no support either from philosophy or from science. It is the outcome, rather, of an uncritical generalization of the conditions encountered by Marx in his own day. The fact that the heyday of capitalism in 1870 was marked by acute capitalist exploitation of wage labor, and that symptoms of a class struggle resulted, is an inadequate reason for announcing the class struggle as the basic law of all previous history, or for regarding economic processes as the ultimate factor governing history in general. The study of social stratification equally cannot proceed, therefore, by merely arguing deductively, from the materialist conception of history's notion of society, that all such divisions ultimately rest on the relations of production. Each form of society must be subjected, rather, to individual empirical analysis, in order to decide which divisions, and how many of them, are present therein, and which happens to be dominant for that particular form. The first objection, then, to be leveled against the Marxian and Soviet duality of the class structure, is that it is unduly deductive in origin, and that it is in any case derived from a premise that has been shown untenable, namely the materialist conception of history. The second is that the subsequent development of the capitalist class society has not in fact followed the course that Marx predicted. His expectation was that the middle stratum would be crushed between the two millstones of the warring classes of capitalism and wage labor, that only a small proportion of this middle group would ascend into the ranks of the capitalists, and that the vast majority would be submerged into the mass of the proletariat. History at first appeared to confirm Marx's prophecy. But around the turn of the century there began an opposite process of development, leading to a revival and increase of the middle class, so that Marx's picture of class society proved to be a mere transitional phase, by no means typical of the structure of modern industrial society. The preservation of the so-called old middle class of craftsmen and traders was due primarily to the invention of the electric motor, which restored the competitive position of the craftsman, not to mention the fact that industrialization itself needed to be supplemented by handwork. The growth of manufacture, and the rationalization of production, with its ever-increasing emphasis on organization, led to a greater demand for administrators and technicians. This and the multiplication of commercial, financial and insurance facilities brought about the formation of a so-called new middle class, consisting of employees. Neither section of the middle class made any common cause with the proletariat. The old group saw descent into the proletariat as a loss of status, which it made every effort to resist, and the new was equally conscious of not belonging to the proletariat, its orientation being, rather, towards the old group, and the classes above. The same was true also of the constantly increasing army of officials in the civil service. Finally, the working class itself no longer formed a monolithic group, once it had succeeded by industrial action in markedly improving its position, and once the development of modern industry had come to require of the worker an ever greater degree of training and specialization. The result was to put many categories of workers in a social and economic position above that of certain sections of the employee class. Hence, in a modern industrial society, the great majority of the population belongs to the middle class. 1 But the whole of this historical development has been ignored by the Soviet theory of classes. Its notions of class are still based, rather, on the situation in 1870. The predominantly speculative and deductive procedure typical of Soviet class theory is also a major defect in its treatment of law and the state. To anyone unacquainted with the matter, it sounds very enlightening to be told that the state is essentially a tool of the exploiting class, which uses its politically coercive powers to establish a rule of the minority over the majority, and that the legal system is no more than the will of the rulers, erected into law. In the hands of the agitator and the demagogue, such opinions can have a very telling effect. But whether they do justice to the facts, is another question. The history of the workers' movement is itself a proof to the contrary. It is precisely due to political democracy that the workers have been able to improve their position, and a decisive change in the class relations of capital and labor has been thereby brought about. The communist view is that political democracy is abortive in the absence of economic equality. But this is simply false. Political democracy means that everyone has the same right to vote and that affairs of state are decided in accordance with the majority view. But that would enable the economic dominance of the numerically small group of exploiters to be very effectively challenged by the political superiority of the vastly greater numbers of the exploited. The claim that the bourgeois state machine is so organized as to exclude the workers from effective participation in politics is sufficiently refuted by pointing to the domestic political situation in Italy, where the Communist Party is within measurable distance of coming to power by parliamentary means. The absurd argument that the freedoms of assembly and the press are illusory, so far as the workers are concerned, since only the possessors can meet the expense of meeting halls, paper, and printing, is rebutted by the readily established fact that in Italian elections, for example, it is the communists who spend most on vote-getting. As for the assertion that in bourgeois democracies the executive arm is not answerable to the voters, anyone familiar with life in a democratic country will know what to think of that. Class struggle or social partnership. And now a few remarks on the theory of the class struggle. To avoid misunderstanding, it will be as well to point out at once that the term class struggle is not always taken in the same sense by everyone who makes use of it. When a Marxist speaks of the class struggle, he thinks of it as a fight to the death, whose object is to annihilate the other class. Here there is complete denial of the other party's right to existence. The aim of this struggle of opposites is not seen as the establishment of a synthesis between thesis and antithesis, the creation of a harmony between the two partners in the labor market, capitalist and wage laborer. On the contrary, it is the task of the workers to destroy the bourgeoisie as a class. The word class struggle is often used, however, in another sense, to denote the sort of encounter between the two parties to the labor market in which neither completely denies the other's right to exist, but merely tries to ensure that the other acknowledges and respects his rights, knowing that each of the two is dependent on the other, and that both have a basic common interest in conducting their undertaking as well as possible. Communism, however, insists on interpreting the class struggle wholly in the first sense, and, as we have seen, distinguishes three forms in which it is carried out: the economic, political, and ideological forms of struggle. The practical necessity of a struggle using economic means of pressure to arrive at a just solution of contentious problems, and a just social order, is fair enough, and accepted also by those who merely regard the class struggle as a confrontation involving mutual recognition. Opinions only begin to differ when the purpose of the conflict is brought into question. It is of particular interest, however, in the present connection, that Soviet ideology still clings even now to the theory of impoverishment, albeit with the proviso that it represents, not an absolute law, but merely a prevailing tendency. Already before the First World War the orthodox Marxists had attempted, by means of this distinction, to rescue the Marxian theory of impoverishment, as against the revisionists, who had abandoned it. Capitalism is merely infected with a tendency towards continual worsening of the worker's lot, and this actually comes about if it does not encounter the resistance of tendencies that work the other way. But this interpretation of Marxism cannot be sustained. For in Marx himself the impoverishment theory is a presupposition of the theory of catastrophe, whereby capitalism is necessarily bound to collapse. But the actual collapse of capitalism can only be brought on by an actual impoverishment of the workers, not by a mere tendency thereto, whose effect is nullified by the resistance of tendencies in the opposite direction. It would seem, however, that in Soviet usage the expression tendency to impoverishment has a rather different meaning, namely that although deviations are possible in individual countries at one time or another, there is nonetheless, in general, an impoverishment of the workers under capitalism that is not merely relative, but absolute, meaning by this a standard of living below the level of subsistence. As Geiger pertinently remarks. However, no elaborate show of statistics is needed to demonstrate the falsity of this view. Anyone acquainted with conditions in the free world can see its absurdity right away. In highly industrialist countries, the workers are so far from impoverishment as to have considerably outstripped the living standards of the petty bourgeoisie. The second form of class struggle is the political. Of this it may also be true, in some sense, that the economic struggle only obtains its full effect by carrying the conflict into the political sphere. It is another question, however, whether it must necessarily extend to a total destruction of the opposition and an abandonment of parliamentary democracy, or whether the establishment of a one-party system is in the interest of the workers themselves. The last point must definitely be answered in the negative. For at the moment when the only party left is the Communist Party, there occurs, and this seems to have been insufficiently noticed hitherto, a necessary change in the relationship between working class and party. So long, that is, as there are several parties, the worker has a genuine alternative. If he chooses the Communist Party, that is a free decision on his part. The presence of another alternative also gives him the chance of exercising some control over his party. But the crucial fact is that if he decides for that party, he also decides for himself what it is committed to do. Yet once the Communist Party is left in sole possession of the field, the situation alters in a fundamental way. No longer, as before, can the worker exert pressure on the party by withdrawal of his vote. In setting up its program, the party can now proceed independently, without having to pay any attention to the voters. The simple non-party member of the working class thereby loses the chance of getting a hearing. Important questions immediately affecting every worker, such as the fixing of wage levels, the length of the working day, determination of the rate of investment and the speed of industrialization, etc., are now decided for him by the party. To whatever extent such party decisions may always be arrived at in the interests of the people, the essential fact here is that it is not the worker himself who ultimately decides, but the party. Engels' definition of freedom comes to mind at this point. As we saw in Part I, it has two components, the appreciation of necessity, and the capacity to make decisions with real knowledge of the subject. The second of these is the privilege of the party. The freedom of the Soviet people is governed by the first, the appreciation of necessity. It consists in activity, based on knowledge of the laws of social development. However good the intentions of the ruling class may be, and even if it succeeds in doing what is best for the country, people will eventually revolt against such tutelage. For man cannot be content with economic and social welfare alone, if it does not also give him the opportunity for full development of his personality, a development which includes both the exercise of his freedom and a share of political responsibility. The results of such paternalism have been all too clearly demonstrated in the fate of what was formerly the Belgian Congo. There was probably no colonial power that did so much as Belgium for the economic benefit of its colonies, thanks largely to the missionaries. Even the educational system was exceptionally well developed at the elementary, and to some extent also at the secondary level. Yet the Belgian government had neglected, when the time was ripe, to release the people of the colony from tutelage, to grant them social equality, or to allow them a share of administrative responsibility. When a university was at last founded at Leopoldville in 1956, it had no faculty of law. The administration could not bring itself to set up a political ruling class inside the country. A slogan circulated in Leopoldville reduced Belgian colonial policy to the following formula: the Negroes of Brazzaville are French citizens, while ours have full bellies. But that man is not satisfied merely with a full belly, and only feels himself really a man when he can have some say in affairs and a share of responsibility, became clear enough from the pressure which led to a precipitate declaration of Congolese independence. Yet the same paternalism underlies the communist conception of the relation between the working class and the party. It is the party that is said to confer their class consciousness on the workers, the party that decides what is to their interest and what is not, and when individual workers have a mind to pursue other aims than those laid down by the party, it is the party's aims that must prevail, as representing the true interests of the working class. Nor is anything altered in this respect by the claim of Soviet ideology, that the transition to communism is marked by a constant increase in social self-government, and that the state will continually be handing over to society the functions it has hitherto discharged, until it finally withers away altogether. For with the withering away of the state and the final approach to communism, the functions of the party will become not less, but ever greater, as was emphasized in May 1960 by a leading article in the official party journal Communist, directed against the Yugoslav revisionists. The political functions of the party will only become extinct when communism has been realized throughout the entire world. Yet even under full communism there will be organs of communist self-government, whose highly conscious and organized activity will not be inferior to that of the party. Even the transformation from a workers' party to a national party, referred to in the new program adopted at the 22nd Party Congress, does nothing to loosen the party's hold on the people. Indeed, the program actually describes the party, in this connection, as the brain, the honor, and the conscience of our epoch, of the Soviet people. If the socialist revolution thus eventually turns against the working class itself, by abolishing all but the Communist Party, the same must be said of the elimination of private property, which Soviet opinion regards as the main object of the political struggle of the working class. Soviet ideology would have the workers believe that a transfer of the means of production into the possession of the whole people is enough to make impossible the appropriation of another person's labor. At first sight this also seems highly plausible. If there are no longer any capitalists, they can no longer take away from the laborer a portion of his work, and if the means of production now belong to the community, the surplus value must go to the community as well. But in practice, things are not so simple. Abolition of private ownership of the means of production does not mean that the latter disappear, they are still there, and somebody has to control them. Production and distribution likewise have to be organized, someone has to lay down hours or work, the prices of individual products have to be related to one another, and a system of wage rates has to be set up. All this, however, is the privilege of the ruling group, the functionaries. But since, in the one-party state, the workers have no chance of exerting any pressure on officialdom, all these duties are left entirely to officials to decide. In particular, they control wage rates, and hence the key to the distribution of the goods produced. And here in fact is the point at which appropriation of another's labor is still possible under socialism, and not only possible, but an actual fact, for wage differentials are vastly greater in the USSR than they are in the West. The worker may no longer work for the capitalists, but he works instead for the minister, the university professor, the military commander, the inventor, the aircraft designer, and so on, whose incomes are much higher in comparison with the lowest wage earners than those of their Western colleagues are in relation to minimum wage rates in the West. Gillas is justified, therefore, in speaking of the formation of a new class under communism. The condition of the workers is rendered exceptionally difficult here by the fact that the functionary is not only in possession of economic power, but also has complete political control, he is the sole employer of labor, and in addition to economic pressures also has the coercive forces of the police at his disposal, hence he is once more in a position to exercise compulsions, not only of an economic, but also of an extra-economic nature, as was earlier the case under slavery and feudalism. Hence the solution lies, not in the abolition of private property, but in the creation of an effective counterbalance to economic and political power. Such a counterbalance may be discerned in the efforts to achieve a maximum dispersal of property, to create a social system which allows all sections of the population to acquire an amount of property which, though modest, may yet ensure them a certain degree of independence. In this, the possessions of the lower orders need not be confined to real property, by means of securities they can also be drawn into part ownership in large industrial undertakings. Soviet ideology thinks that such people's capitalism can be dismissed as ineffectual by pointing to the fact that in America 2/3 of all stock holdings are owned by 1% of the families. The small investors' right to be heard would be an illusion in this case, since the large shareholders thereby retain control over the scanty savings of the little men. But 7. The fact that an idea is imperfectly realized in one instance does not entail that the idea itself is false. It is perfectly conceivable that an effective dispersal of capital could be attained by appropriate policies of guidance on the part of the state. A further and no less effective safeguard against the abuse of economic power is to be found in the workers' right of combination. This was precisely the method by which the workers of the West secured emancipation, by setting up a monopoly of labor power in opposition to monopoly in the means of production. In its theory of classes and the class struggle, communist ideology always proceeds one-sidedly from the assertion that, without access to the means of production, labor power is impotent, and hence that the worker, if he is not to starve, is delivered over for good or ill to the owners of the means of production. But these means themselves cannot be operated without labor power. Hence the factory owner comes in turn to be dependent on his workers, a dependence that may become very palpable when the latter create a monopoly of their labor power in the form of a trade union movement. In the second half of the 19th century the workers of Europe began to recognize their opportunities in this respect, and attempted to organize themselves into unions. To be sure, the entrepreneurs did all they could to prevent the formation of such labor monopolies, but the workers were eventually successful in gaining the upper hand. It is important to note in this connection that their success was made possible by the very fact of political democracy, a further proof of the falsity of the communist contention, that the bourgeois democratic state is a one-sided representative of the interests of the exploiters. The outcome of this struggle was that in many states the right to combine, the right to strike and similar social concessions became entrenched parts of the Constitution. The success of this economic struggle owed more than a little to its extension into the political sphere, and this can be regarded as an element of truth in the communist doctrine, that the economic struggle can only achieve its full effect by way of the political struggle. There is an ambiguity here, however, which should not be overlooked. The result of the conflict was not, as communist ideology will have it, the replacement of the dictatorship of one party by that of the other, but rather what Theodore Geiger has described as an institutionalization of the class struggle. The importance of this cannot, indeed, be overstressed, since the tension between capital and labor has now been recognized as a structural feature of the labor market and erected into a socio-legal principle. The weapons, methods, and tactics of the class struggle are recognized and at the same time brought under control. The conflict is conducted in accordance with definite rules of play. Most of the sting is thereby withdrawn from the class struggle, it is transformed into a legitimate tension between power factors, which hold one another in check. Capital and wage labor grapple together, effect compromises, negotiate in orderly fashion and thereby determine wage rates, hours of labor and other conditions of work. It should not be overlooked, moreover, that this institutionalization of the class struggle is not a mere outcome of political conflict alone. A series of intra-economic factors has also contributed to this change in the mutual relationships of wage labor and capital. The better the workers' position has become, the more the unions have begun to realize that they cannot go on indefinitely with further demands for pay. An additional rise in benefits is dependent on greater productivity in industry itself, for which new capital investment is required. With increasing prosperity, the cultural level of the workers has also risen. They have begun to realize that it would be against their own interests to endanger the prospects of their undertaking by extravagant wage demands, and that their own interests and those of the entrepreneurs are not simply opposed, but are to some extent actually identical. The institutionalization of the class struggle has brought about an essential change in the economic system, as compared with what Marx described as capitalism. Early capitalism could rightly be described as such, insofar as capital was virtually the only economic factor determining the order of society. But now this is no longer so, since wage labor, as well as capital, has come to play a similar role. Hence it is questionable whether the name capitalism should still be attached to the current economic order of things. The institutionalist class struggle is also qualitatively distinct, however, from the Marxist variety, inasmuch as the participants no longer seek each other's destruction, or the replacement of the other's dictatorship by their own. The unions respect the employers as social partners, just as the employers, in turn, acknowledge the unions as a part of the social order. It is worth asking, therefore, whether, in view of its burden of communist associations, the term class struggle might not better be replaced by another, as in German the expression Auseinandersetzung has for some years actually begun to come into use. A few words in conclusion on the ideological class struggle. The striking thing about the treatment of this subject in Fundamentals of Marxist Philosophy is that here the talk is, not of an ideological struggle between the workers and the bourgeoisie, but rather of a struggle between the party and the working class, who have to be cleansed of the survivals of bourgeois consciousness, indoctrinated by the party with true socialist class consciousness, and constantly protected against the seductive accents of bourgeois propaganda. This is not to say that in Soviet literature there is no mention of an ideological struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. On the contrary, it is carried so far as to involve reference to a class struggle in science, as was alleged in connection with the recently revived controversy over Michurin's theory of inheritance, the polemic of Soviet genetics, founded by Michurin, against the reactionary, bourgeois genetics of Mendel and Morgan, reflects the ideological class struggle of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie. We shall have more to say of this in the next chapter. Dialectical development under socialism and communism. In our full-dress discussion of the materialist conception of history in the last chapter, there was one final notion that we postponed for the time being, namely the problem of the historical dialectic. We must now enter briefly upon it, as an adjunct to the problem of the class struggle. The question as to whether, in the classless society, the dialectic is due to come to a standstill, has long been one of the points in the Marxist canon to attract the heaviest criticism. The possibility of a dialectic under socialism can be questioned on two counts. Dialectic Beethoven's primarily a struggle of opposites. The efficacy of the dialectic in historical development was first detected by Marx in the struggle between bourgeoisie and proletariat. But how can there still be dialectical development under socialism and communism, if the class struggle is there at an end? Dialectic also signifies a transformation of quantitative changes into qualitative. In the evolution of society, qualitative change consists in the transition to a new social formation, by way of revolution. But how can such a dialectic continue, if the proletarian revolution is the last, and socialism and communism are the final types of social order? We have already referred in passing to the solution of these questions that the Soviet ideologists have available. They distinguish on the one hand between antagonistic and non-antagonistic contradictions, and on the other between explosive and gradual qualitative leaps. Let us first consider contradiction as the motive force of development in socialist society. In Soviet theory there should still be contradictions under socialism and communism, to maintain social progress, but they are now supposed to be non-antagonistic in character. Social groups divided only by non-antagonistic contradictions remain united by common interests, in spite of their opposition. Such are said to be the oppositions, under socialism, between town and country, workers and peasants, manual and mental labor. Similar oppositions prevail also in the struggle of the forces of progress against the ancient, the obsolete, the slothful, the bureaucratic elements, etc., under socialism. The notion of non-antagonistic contradictions is, however, an unmeaning one. The contradictions involved in social development are not logical in character, but represent a struggle of opposites. Non-antagonistic implies an absence of struggle, and contradictions of this sort would thus imply a struggle of opposites without any struggle. Yet Soviet ideology obstinately maintains that they do entail a struggle, only one that does not reach the point of conflict. Conflict is here understood as a life and death affair, in which one side not only defeats the other, but annihilates it. The difference between the two sorts of contradiction therefore lies in the fact that in the one the struggle reaches the point of conflict, whereas in the other the main tendency is in the direction of gradual mitigation and loss of bitterness. But if we look more closely at the examples of non-antagonistic contradiction presented to our notice, it is evident that they represent a situation that really ought not to exist, and therefore has to be the more fully eliminated, the closer society approaches to the communist ideal. They either represent certain abuses left over from the capitalist past, which have not yet been wholly overcome, or else deficiencies stemming from temporary and chance failings on the part either of individual members of society, or individual members of the governing class. This implies, however, that non-antagonistic contradictions come to be of less and less importance in social development, that they have no positive function under full communism, and that they exist only because, and insofar as, success in eliminating various minor shortcomings has not yet been attained. One might perhaps ascribe some positive importance to the non-antagonistic contradiction embodied in the so-called economic law of socialism. This is the contradiction between the constantly rising production of material and cultural goods and the popular demand which constantly outstrips this production. The more goods are manufactured, the more new needs come into being. But this contradiction only concerns the development of the economy. The question at issue here, however, is whether, and on the basis of what contradictions, society is due to develop under socialism and communism. And it is obvious that economic contradictions can only bring about social development by first evoking social contradictions, as happens under capitalism, in the Soviet view. There, the basic contradiction is that between the social character of production and the individual appropriation of the product, resulting in a social contradiction between the owners of the means of production and the working class. Thus the contradiction in capitalist production affects social development through its transformation into a social conflict, namely the class struggle. So if the further progress of socialism is to be occasioned by the recurrent economic clash between existing levels of production and constantly increasing needs, it can only be so if the clash becomes a social one. The question we began with therefore remains unanswered: where are the social contradictions that are supposed to make for progress under socialism and communism? Do they lie in such trivialities as the struggle against inertia and bureaucracy, which are supposed to become ever more infrequent as society approaches communism, while social development itself goes on more vigorously than ever? The dynamism of the process would then be in inverse proportion to the strength of the contradictions engendering it, since these latter are represented as constantly on the wane. It should also be noted that such non-antagonistic contradictions, no longer leading to social conflict, but resolved, rather, by taking thought, are by no means a privilege reserved to the socialist order of society. If the whole theory of the matter be translated out of the official jargon into plain English, its core of truth is seen to be the commonplace assertion that sociological inquiry can be of value to political leaders as a means of preventing social conflicts. But this is something that is done with no less, and indeed with considerably greater success in the free world. The very fact referred to above, that in many Western countries the class struggle has lost its former bitterness and turned into a process of class adjustment, is a good example of this. Such class adjustment is a perfect illustration of what Soviet terminology describes as non-antagonistic contradiction. For the aim of the struggle is no longer a conflict, in which one side exterminates the other, and both contestants are united by a common underlying interest, insofar as the workers themselves are generally well aware nowadays that a maximum of productive capacity in their undertaking is not only in the interest of the entrepreneur, but also in their own. We fare no better with the Soviet reply to the question, whether, under socialism, there are still qualitative transitions in social development to new and higher forms of society. Such transitions would indeed necessarily imply a dialectical leap, that is, a revolution. Soviet ideology sees the answer in a distinction between explosive and gradual leaps. In a class society, the upward transitions from one social order to another occur in a violent, explosive fashion, by way of revolution. Under socialism they are quite different, they occur gradually and no longer lead to the collapse of the existing regime. Examples of such leaps are to be found in revolutionary changes in the fields of science, technology, and production. The fact that these leaps are gradual does nothing, however, to resolve the difficulty. For what matters in a qualitative transition is not the tempo of its occurrence, but the fact that it leads to a new quality, that the old quality perishes and a new takes its place. In social development this would imply the displacement of the existing order by a new one. As for the proffered examples of such revolutionary changes under socialism, they are open to the same objections as those just urged against non-antagonistic contradictions. They again relate merely to the economic field, not to society as such. If, however, there was still a true dialectic of social development under socialism and communism, it would seem necessarily to require the disappearance and supersession of the existing social quality, namely the economic order of socialism and communism. It will be seen, therefore, that in theory and practice alike the Soviet conception of the classless society is a thing of naught. In practice, because state ownership of productive resources, and the one-party system, have led to the replacement of the class of owners by a new class of controllers of the means of production, whose powers of appropriating the labor of others is, not less, but vastly greater than before. In theory, because under a classless society the dialectic of social development would come to a halt, though dialectical and historical materialism both declare it to be the source of all movement whatsoever. 4. Social consciousness. The general picture of the materialist conception of history is now before us, and in the foregoing chapter we have also dealt in more detail with the basis and the political superstructure. It remains to examine the second aspect of the superstructure, namely its so-called ideological side. Ideologies, in historical materialist parlance, are the various forms of social consciousness, as manifested primarily in law, morals, art, science, philosophy, and religion. The expression cultural life of society is also used for the same purpose. As we know already from the chapter on the materialist conception of history, historical materialism conceives of social consciousness as a reflection of social being. Social being means the production of material goods. Social consciousness means firstly the various social theories, but also social psychology. Social being is independent of social consciousness and is the ultimate source of all spontaneity, whereas social consciousness is dependent, a product and reflection of social being. This dependence was especially close and obvious at the lowest stage of man's development, in primitive society. Mental work at that time was not yet separate and distinct from physical labor, but was completely enmeshed in the material life of society. Art, for example, was no more than a depiction of man's productive activity. Religious belief reflected the helplessness of early man in face of the powers of nature. There were still no legal conceptions of mine and thine. The prevailing consciousness was that of the collectivity. As men procured their means of existence in common, they knew nothing, as yet, of private property. Everything belonged to everyone. But once the productive forces had developed and a division of labor had arisen, especially through the divorce of mental from physical work, the mental life of man became more complex, as did social life in general. The mental attained a relative independence, though retaining always its basic relationship to the material life of society. Thus when slavery, for example, became economically unprofitable, it also came to be felt as unjust. The ideas of freedom and equality arose in similar fashion from the economic demands of incipient capitalism. When idealist sociology locates the ultimate driving forces of historical development in human thought, it is incapable, says historical materialism, of explaining the origin of such ideas, which the latter is in fact able to do. It is desirable to recall here briefly what we have already referred to in connection with the problem of basis and superstructure. The link between social being and social consciousness is a more or less mediate one. In the examples just given, the connection is relatively open and direct. But it would be vulgar materialism to try to establish an immediate connection between some work of art or philosophical theory and the economic circumstances. The latter operate through intermediaries and chiefly by way of the basis, i.e., social relationships. By social psychology, Soviet ideology understands the totality of social feelings, moods, impressions, customs, thoughts, illusions, etc., spontaneously produced among men under the immediate influence of their conditions of daily life. It is obviously an essential feature of this definition that we should be dealing with such feelings, etc., as arise under the influence of the conditions of life. It is not all human moods and feelings, therefore, that are of social significance, but only those which reflect the social condition of mankind. They include, for example, class-determined sympathies and antipathies, hatred for certain social groups and trust in others, etc. These moods and feelings therefore have a class character. Their roots in the social conditions of existence are for the most part unconscious. But as soon as they are brought into the light of consciousness and find embodiment in social theories and so on, they become an ideology. This is not to suggest, however, that the social ideology of a class represents no more than a generalization of its class psychology. For it arises more especially through conscious consideration of social relationships, and of the previous history of the ideological realm in question. Social psychology must be sharply distinguished from the national habits of thought that are common to all classes in a nation. The latter determine the national form of an ideology and culture, whereas its content is class-determined. The social psychology of progressive epochs is marked by courage, joie de vivre, and optimism, whereas in periods of decadence there is an atmosphere of pessimism. Interest is concentrated on the experience of the individual, erotic motives gain the upper hand, etc. There is a further important question concerning the relation between individual and social consciousness. Unfortunately, We are told nothing on this subject beyond the two assertions that between each there is an interconnection, so that it is impermissible to isolate individual from social consciousness, and that social consciousness has no existence of its own apart from the individual consciousness of man. But as to what the relative independence of social from individual consciousness consists in, and how it is to be explained, we are given no information. It is merely pointed out that it is of great importance, for practice, to have regard to the peculiarities of individual consciousness, example when it is a matter of winning over members of the bourgeois intelligentsia to communism. One, for example, will be more impressed by ethical considerations, such as the injustice of the capitalist system, another, by the appeal to science, a third, by artistic achievements, and so on, again, the struggle against capitalist survivals. In man's consciousness must also give attention to the mental peculiarities of the given individual. 2. The class character of ideology. Ideological factors common to men in general. As noted in our treatment of the theory of basis and superstructure, historical materialism teaches that social consciousness has a class character. The opinions, inclinations, feelings, and customs of a class are evoked by its conditions of life and correspond to its class interests. They then find embodiment in the corresponding social theories, moral norms, etc. Behind all moral, religious, political, and social theories, therefore, Marxism-Leninism always smells class interests of some description, which it endeavors to expose. Those who frame the ideology of a class need not themselves be unconditional products of this class. At the outset of bourgeois society, the ideology of the bourgeoisie was also formulated by scions of the nobility, and in like fashion the founders of Marxism, the proletarian ideology, were themselves of bourgeois descent. In class society, the dominant ideology is that of the ruling class. Yet elements of this outlook are often adopted also by the oppressed classes, owing to the fact that the ruling class has a powerful propaganda machine at its disposal, and that, by virtue of their living conditions and the prevailing economic relations, the oppressed are also subjected to the dominant ideas of the time. All classes hitherto have supposed their ideology to express the interests of society as a whole. Soviet ideology admits that, up to a certain time, so long, that is, as the classes in question were struggling for emancipation, there was a certain justice in this claim. The historical circumstances of the struggle have made the progressive class, at least for a certain period, the spokesman of the interests of the whole society, the whole people. This is especially true of the War of the French. Enlightenment against feudalism, in the name of liberty and equality, reason and justice. But it eventually became clear that behind these ideals were hidden the highly egoistic class interests of the bourgeoisie. From this point on, Soviet ideology proceeds to an extremely important innovation in historical materialism, to be found in the textbook Fundamentals of Marxist Philosophy, namely to the admission that despite their class character, ideologies contain elements of a universally human kind. As was seen in our discussion of the materialist conception of history, the development of each ruling class in the past has gone through an early period, during which it achieved progress and could therefore be said to have a progressive character. So far as these classes were progressive in their day, there were progressive elements in the philosophical and social theories, the art and morality, which served them and bore the marks of their class origin. Such universal human elements are possible, however, not only in the early progressive period of a class, but quite generally wherever the creator of an ideology has been able to transcend the limited outlook of his own class and to adopt the viewpoint of the people as a whole. The great achievements of classical art, created by members of the ruling class, give expression, more or less, to a content common to the whole people, because their creators were able to rise above the limited interests of their class, because they had recourse to the living sources of popular wisdom and creativity, and were thus able in their works to reflect the truth about life and the interests of the masses of the people. It now becomes possible to see what this whole theory would be at. For since, in the communist view, the revolutionary struggle of the proletariat is a prelude, not only to the liberation of its own class, but to the elimination of class divisions in society generally. This class is the first to achieve what all previous rising classes merely purported to do, namely to promote the interests of society as a whole. Hence the ideology of the proletariat not only gives expression to its own class interests, but also to those of mankind in general. In the socialist ideology of the proletariat, the class content is at the same time essentially common to all mankind, for with the proletariat there arises, for the first time in history, a class that is thoroughly and consistently revolutionary and free from class limitations, and whose historical mission lies in the creation of the classless society for the role of ideas in social development. In treating of the problem of basis and superstructure, we made passing reference to the fact that, in Soviet Marxist eyes, the superstructure does not stand to the basis in a relation of purely passive dependence, but rather has a certain relative independence and also a certain active role to play. We must now take a further look at this. That the superstructure, 7.e, social ideas and theories, should be able to enjoy a relative independence, is due to its status as a reflection of social being. As such, it only changes in consequence of a change in social being. Hence it is possible for consciousness to lag behind being. Obsolete social theories often continue to have effects even after the social structure has altered, since there are often elements interested in preserving them. But then again, consciousness may also run ahead of the development of being. This was particularly so when Marx and Engels discovered the laws of social development, and thereby made it possible to predict this development scientifically, at least in broad outline. That ideas have a relative independence of social being is also evinced by the fact that the ideas of one period are historically derivative from those of the preceding epoch, and hence are not solely determined by social being. Hence one cannot deduce everything in the ideas of a period from economic relationships. Nor is it only the past that affects contemporary thinking, since there is also an interplay between the various ideologies current at a given time. Thus art and literature, for example, may be influenced by philosophy, philosophy by religion or science, science by philosophy, etc. It would thus be vulgar materialism to attempt a deduction of ideological content exclusively and directly from economic considerations. Nor is it only a matter of content, since it would be equally improper to regard the evolutionary level of the various types of social consciousness as immediately determined by production. It may well happen that economically backward periods may have superlative achievements to display in the field of art, for example. It is claimed for all that, however, that the development of social consciousness, 1.e, of culture, is governed and the last resort by material production. The relative independence of ideas thus makes it possible for Soviet ideology to ascribe to them an active role in social development as well. Our discussion of basis and superstructure has already made mention of this. The ascription of activity to ideas is again designed to protect the theory from vulgar materialism, which is accused of denying the role of ideas in social development. The malign effects of such a view are that it condemns man to passivity and makes him a slave to historical fatalism. The vulgar materialist fails to grasp that historical necessity operates, not as an external force set over mankind, but only through man's own activity. Ideas are alleged to play a specially important part in social development under socialism. It is here that, thanks to historical materialism, mankind has its first opportunity of guiding its own destiny. In class society, development was spontaneous and not yet subject to human control. The forces behind it appeared mysterious and alien to man. Marx, however, pointed out the real determining factor, namely production, and so laid the basis whereby men, through control of the economic process, could henceforth consciously shape their history as a whole. Even with the discovery of the basic law, it is admittedly not yet possible for the socialist consciousness to reflect every detail of social development with equal completeness. The laws express the essence of what is going on, and this essence does not lie on the surface, but is hidden in the depths. Hence there is need for detailed theoretical analysis of current happenings and new developments, and this is provided by the Communist Party, and especially by its Central Committee. Hence the great importance attached by Soviet ideology to propaganda and the communist education of the masses. It is a matter of passing on the knowledge of the leaders to the masses and inciting them to appropriate activities and attitudes. It is stressed that such communist education must not be merely political in character, but should embrace the whole man by all-round instruction, further education in science, and especially by moral and aesthetic influence. The aim is to create a new sort of man, for the transition from socialism to communism presupposes so high a level of consciousness in men that at their own wish they will work according to their capacities and observe the rules of community life. 4. The role of the masses and of personality in history. Fundamentals of Marxist philosophy deals with this issue in a special chapter of historical materialism, following that on social consciousness. Fundamentals of Marxism-Leninism also devotes a special chapter to the subject. But we shall depart from this practice by entering upon the matter here. For one thing, the range of ideas involved is extraordinarily scanty, and can easily be covered in a page or two. And for another, its subject matter is quite intimately associated with the problems presently under discussion. For the question as to the role of personality is closely linked with that of the importance of consciousness in social development. And the problem of the role of the masses in history has already been touched upon. In our treatment of the theory of social consciousness, we have already been struck by the tendency to elaborate historical materialism in a fashion which would leave room in it for universal human values, which never lose their validity, and which transcend class dependence. The theoretical justification for this innovation is looked for in an appeal to the people as exponents of such values. Thus the people now appear on the scene in a similar role to that of the working class, as the bearers of true social being and consciousness. The point in historical materialism at which the people as such make their entry is in connection with the forces of production. The production of commodities is the ultimately decisive factor in social development. But the masses are the main force conditioning the growth of production. Hence the history of society is by and large a history of the masses. The people are the creators of history is a phrase very frequently to be met with in the writings of Soviet sociologists. In the material process of production the workers produce and reproduce the material life of society. They perfect their tools and accumulate experience. Thus historical development is pushed on from day to day by the working people, even during periods when they are politically quiescent. The people are not, however, a uniform, shapeless mass, but are differentiated in various ways. There are progressive and backward elements, and in class society the population is made up of different classes. The hard core of the people is represented, however, by the workers. The role of the masses in history becomes ever greater, according to Soviet ideology, the more their awareness and degree of organization are accentuated in the course of the class struggle. But only under socialism will their creative energies be able to come to full fruition. These creative powers extend, moreover, not only to material, but also to spiritual goods. Soviet ideology emphasizes nonetheless that in stressing the role of the masses it by no means wishes to depreciate the importance of individual personality. There is an attempt to counter Stammler's charge, that Marxism transforms the individual into a puppet of historical necessity. There is no contradiction at all between accepting that historical development is governed by objective laws, and allowing a role to the individual. On the contrary, it is only through the presence of some such laws, and the knowledge thereof, that the individual ceases to be a puppet of historical contingency and of an unknown necessity beyond his control, and gains the opportunity of acting consciously, freely, and with knowledge of the facts. Were he to attempt something in disregard of the necessity thus to be discerned in history, he would inevitably come to grief and emerge in the role of a Don Quixote. But if the course of history is governed by an objective necessity, what is there left for the individual to do? What can his importance consist in? In Soviet opinion the individual is admittedly incapable of affecting the main outlines of the historical process, but he can certainly intervene to promote or hinder it. The acts of individuals thereby introduce a certain element of contingency into history, but this cannot impair the necessity involved, since in dialectical materialism contingency and necessity form a pair of categories that are not mutually exclusive, but condition and complement each other. The contingencies wrought by individuals affect only details of the historical process, without disturbing its general outline. If one man refuses to do his stint in realizing historical necessity, another will take his place and do it for him, though perhaps in some other way. History shows that the right men have always been available, whenever there was a job to be done. The Soviet explanation is, that their achievement was not wholly their own. Everything that had gone before contributed to what they did. Even if there had never been a Pythagoras, we should certainly know his theorem today. The work of a great scientist is always assisted in some fashion by all the science that preceded it. This is not to deny that great men bring something of their own to the accomplishment of mighty tasks, it is they who apprehend these tasks more quickly, deeply, and clearly than the rest. A special application of this is also made to the role of leading figures in the workers' movement. The three great leaders of the working class are said to be Marx, Engels, and Lenin. But besides them the movement has brought forth in all countries a string of other important leaders and organizers. If historical materialism also stresses the historical role of the masses, it is no less opposed, on the other hand, to the anarchist tendency to deny all authority whatsoever. The experience, the knowledge, and the authority of the leaders are a product of many years' experience of struggle, and are of great value to the party and the working class in general. At the same time, it is equally necessary to reject the idealist cult of personality, which consists in a superstitious and blind reverence for the leader's authority. On this score, the chief target of criticism is Stalin. Stalin is still prized to this day as a great Marxist theoretician and organizer, sincerely dedicated to the communist cause, but there is disapproval of the cult of personality that he permitted during the last years of his life. This is regarded as something of a tragedy for him, in that subjectively he was devoted to Leninism, the working class, and the people. The emergence of the cult is blamed, on the one hand, on historical circumstances, namely that Stalin was obliged to build up socialism in the Soviet Union at a time when the country was subject to capitalist encirclement, necessitating strong central leadership and a temporary abridgment of democracy. On the other hand, the growth of the cult is attributed to certain personal defects on Stalin's own part, already pointed out by Lenin in 1922.1. The first point to be made against the historical materialist theory of social consciousness is that the concept itself is wanting in clarity. The main thing that remains obscure is whether this social consciousness is to be interpreted in a psychological sense, as the thought, feeling, effort, and will, etc., of individuals, or whether it has a reality of its own beyond this, and how such a collective consciousness is to be taken. As seen in our account of the Soviet theory, it is certainly expressly maintained that social consciousness has no existence of its own apart from that of the individual. Yet it is said to possess a relative independence of the latter. But how can this be, if it does not exist separately and independently of the consciousness of the individual? The statements concerning the role of social consciousness also leave it uncertain whether it is to be regarded as an individual consciousness or a collective one. The psychological interpretation seems presupposed wherever reference is made to its role in the revolutionary struggle. This role is briefly as follows: in class society the same social being presents a different appearance, according to the class status of the person observing the social order, just as a mountain will appear differently, depending on the viewpoint of the observer. A member of the possessing classes will find truth, beauty, and goodness in anything that tends to preserve private property and the current social order, since he assuredly benefits from this. But a member of the dispossessed class will equally find truth, beauty, and goodness in anything that furthers abolition of the practice of exploitation. The difference in cognition will also occasion a difference of attitude towards social reality. A person who sees virtue in anything that contributes to its elimination will direct his will to destruction of the existing social order. 2. He will necessarily become a partisan of revolution. It is obvious, however, that here we must be speaking of consciousness in the psychological sense, as manifested by actual men. For only real, living, men can instigate a revolution. Yet in another connection, social consciousness makes its appearance as a thing independent of the individual mind. This is the case wherever Marxist-Leninist ideology speaks of the possibility of a defective or even false class consciousness among individual members of the working class. Such a false class consciousness is said to be present, for example, when individual workers' associations attempt to struggle for economic betterment at the expense of other groups, or when individual workers set out to work harder at the expense of their fellows, or when the workers pursue merely economic gains as the object of the class struggle, and do not understand that their true interest lies in a political transformation of society, namely in the establishment of socialism. In all these cases, the aims adopted by such individual members of the working class are not identical with true class interest. 7. With the goals that are, or ought to be, pursued by the class as such. So here there is a discrepancy between the psychological consciousness of the actual living worker and class consciousness proper. Lenin even goes so far as to maintain that the workers themselves can only generate a trade union consciousness, extending merely to awareness of the need for economic struggle to improve their living conditions. They cannot advance to real socialist class consciousness, the recognition that their economic interests can be realized only by a political transformation of society and the establishment of socialism. This understanding can only be imparted to them from without. Marx and Engels, as Lenin acknowledges, were themselves, socially speaking, members of the bourgeois intelligentsia. Thus the theory of socialism, 7. A socialist class consciousness, cannot be engendered by the working class, but arises outside it and is thought out by products of other classes. It is evident that class consciousness in this sense can no longer be understood psychologically, but must be regarded as a state of mind distinct from that of the actual working man. The notion of social or class consciousness thus proves, in consequence, to be ambiguous and unclear. A further and more damaging objection to the historical materialist notion of social consciousness is as follows: whether this consciousness be regarded as individual or collective, it is impossible in either case to demonstrate that it is conditioned by social being. Let us take it first of all in the psychological sense. So understood, it must be conceded that the same social being does not always give rise to the same state of consciousness. The decisive feature in social being which produces a proletarian class consciousness is that the forces of labor are divorced from the means of production. Those who own these means develop a bourgeois class consciousness, and those who do not, and are compelled to sell their labor, generate a proletarian outlook dedicated to abolition of the existing order. But the trouble with this is that it simply does not hold water. There have been sections of society who lived by selling their labor but have never produced a proletarian consciousness, for example the agricultural laborers, who are often much worse paid than the industrial workers, and the salaried employees, whose lower ranks are equally badly off, financially, when compared with the workers. Even for the latter, indeed, the claim only holds good in a very limited degree. There are strata among factory workers who have fashioned a different ideology, and only under exceptional circumstances have even the hardcore workers exhibited a truly revolutionary point of view. This it was that constrained Lenin himself to admit that, left to themselves, the workers are capable of advancing only to a trade union, and not to a genuinely socialist revolutionary consciousness. Thus if we begin by taking consciousness in its psychological sense, as attaching to individual members of a given class, the answer is that it is not governed by class status, inasmuch as other factors may also have a decisive effect on the state of mind. If, however, we no longer interpret class consciousness as the mental state of individual members of a class, but take it in Lenin's sense, as a collective consciousness independent of this, which was worked out by Marx and Engels and is now to be brought to the workers by the Communist Party, we can see that in this case also it is not conditioned by social being. What is this collective consciousness? It is a mass of thoughts, feelings, wishes, etc., which the working class cannot produce on its own, though it ought to have done so, and which, as G. Lukács puts it, it would have produced if it had been in a position to grasp its social position to the full. It cannot produce this consciousness unaided because, as Lenin asserted, scientific socialism grew out of the philosophic, historical, and economic theories that were elaborated by the educated representatives of the propertied classes, the intellectuals. Hence it is not the social being of the workers that produces their social consciousness, for the latter is an outcome of the philosophy and science evolved by other classes. The traditional Marxist theory of basis and superstructure has been extended in a remarkable fashion by contemporary Soviet teaching as to the presence of universal human elements even in the ideologies of earlier classes. This view first found clear expression in fundamentals of Marxist philosophy. It implies in practice an abandonment of the doctrine that social consciousness is class-determined, and an admission that it is not proletarian consciousness alone that is capable of seeing the world rightly, but also the consciousness of other classes as well. The exponents of such universal values include, not only the proletariat, but also the people. If this enlargement of historical materialism is seriously intended, and not just a temporary alleviation to be dropped again later, it implies that Soviet ideology is on the road to a renunciation of that relativism which has hitherto infected the materialist conception of history. On such a view, we again have eternal truths and imperishable values, which preserve their validity in every age. The acknowledgement of universal human elements in the social consciousness of earlier periods leads logically to a further consequence, the abandonment of the principle of partisanship. For if, as was admitted in the passage quoted from Fundamentals of Marxist Philosophy, the representatives of the ruling class are capable of rising above the limited interests of their class, the proletariat is no longer the sole repository of truth, and members of other classes also have access to it. If the recognition of unchanging, universal human elements and values, even in social forms of consciousness of a non-proletarian kind, is to be taken seriously, a radical alteration would thereby ensue in the controversial standpoints of adherents and opponents of the materialist conception of history. Its supporters could now no longer maintain that philosophy, art, morals, etc., are class-determined. Once the required corrections have been made to the materialist conception, the situation appears as follows: its partisans assume the class character of ideology, but admit nonetheless that there may be, and have been, objective elements of truth at all times in human thought, and furthermore, that there are generally acceptable criteria for deciding which elements in the various systems are universally valid, and which are conditioned by the point of view. The non-Marxist, by contrast, assumes that everyone is capable, in the last resort, of attaining to objective truth, without thereby wishing to deny that, consciously or otherwise, theories and systems have often been propounded to serve the economic and political interests of particular social groups. Controversy between the two would thus increasingly center upon establishing where the actual boundaries between the universal and the relativistic elements lie. But that is a question that is certainly open to discussion. It is essential, however, to realize here that such an extension of the materialist conception only bears upon the problem of class determination of the various spheres of intellectual culture. Such a concession would leave untouched the basic thesis of historical materialism, that social consciousness is ultimately determined by social being, i.e., by the economic factor. But this thesis is subject to all the objections brought against it in Part 2, Chapter 2. 5. The individual forms of social consciousness. Whatever the aspects or expressions of men's social being that are reflected in their consciousness, and whatever the type of reflection involved, the result is always some form of social consciousness, law, morals, philosophy, science, etc. In the earliest days of man's development there was no such variety of forms of consciousness as we have today. In primeval society, human knowledge was still restricted to certain basic notions of natural phenomena, which provided it with the means of ensuring existence in the struggle with nature. Certain habits and customs were formed, which were passed on from one generation to another, and constituted the morality of the period. The first beginnings of artistic activity were also already to be found in primitive society. Religious ideas, in Soviet theory, came later. The division of society into classes saw the earliest formation of political and juristic ideologies. Philosophy followed, and science in due course separated off from this. Political and legal ideologies have already been referred to. The others require a brief mention. And here we shall proceed from science, which reflects the real most accurately, to religion, which in Soviet eyes is the farthest removed from reality, and renders it in a distorted fashion. Science. Science, like all other human knowledge, issues from the demands of practice, and especially the demands of production. Thus astronomy, for example, arose from the need to reckon the seasons and as an aid to navigation in travel. The enormous advances of modern science are likewise due to the requirements of heavy industry. Stalin's letters on linguistics made a breach in the scheme of basis and superstructure, owing to his removal of language from that scheme, and since then Soviet ideology has also begun to detach other mental phenomena from the system, starting with formal logic and certain areas of science. Though science, like other ideologies, is a form of social consciousness, its content is not wholly class-determined. This is because in many of its branches, at least, it has a direct connection with production. Scientific knowledge, as confirmed by practice, contains objective truths that are preserved from generation to generation, from epoch to epoch, and from one formation to another. Replacement of one economic basis by another does not destroy it, but constantly advances it further. The Newtonian law of gravitation, the laws of conservation of mass and energy, etc., are objective truths independent of mankind, and of use in different modes of production. But apart from such incontrovertible propositions, science also contains other elements, namely the theories and philosophies used to interpret and justify them. And here we find a heated battle of opinions, reflecting the class struggle occurring in society. This struggle rages most violently in the sphere of the social sciences, since their subject matter directly involves class interests. But the class struggle also has repercussions in the natural sciences. The standard example of Soviet conceptions of class struggle in this area is the controversy over genetics. The classical genetics of Mendel and Morgan postulated genes unalterable by breeding as the medium of inheritance, and was therefore branded as metaphysical and reactionary, whereas the dialectical Soviet genetics of Michurin and Lysenko was held to be progressive, in contrast to the Western view. By this opposition of bourgeois metaphysics to the dialectical ideology of the proletariat, the conflict between the two schools of genetics was viewed as an outcome of the bourgeois proletarian class struggle in the field of natural science. The right of science to nonpartisan status is also rejected. So far as bourgeois scientists claim to be above party, this is regarded as hypocrisy. The proletariat, for its part, makes no claim at all to be non-party, and makes open and deliberate avowal of its adherence to the principle of partisanship, even in science, convinced that the proletarian world outlook is a repository of objective truth, this because the subjective interests of the proletariat coincide with the objective course of historical development, and because the proletariat is fighting not only for its own emancipation, but at the same time for the abolition of all classes and all exploitation. The Soviet accusation against capitalism is that under it science is enslaved. Capitalist monopolies treat scientific investigation solely as a tool to further their own interests. So long as science and technology promise to increase profits, they are encouraged, but as soon as new discoveries threaten the maximization of profit, opportunities for their free development are curtailed. Not infrequently there is downright persecution of the scientist whose inquiries run counter to the class interests and prejudices of the exploiting group. It also comes about that correct scientific findings are wrongly interpreted under the influence of false philosophical dogmas. Hence, for its healthy development, Science needs not only equipment of a material kind, laboratories, experimental facilities, measuring instruments, etc., but also an equipment of ideas, to guide the researcher's thinking along the right lines. Such an armory of ideas is provided for him in dialectical materialism. 2. Philosophy. Philosophy, as a form of social consciousness, gives expression to the world outlook of this class or that. As we saw in Part I, communist ideology knows of only two main viewpoints in philosophy, materialism and idealism. The discipline itself arose as an antithesis to religion, and, as the world outlook of the progressive forces in society, was at first inclined to materialism. But on arriving at a point where society had already split into classes, there immediately arose the counter-movement of idealism. Materialist tendencies have commonly given expression to the outlook of progressive classes, while idealism is normally the viewpoint of reactionary ones. Idealist philosophy is closely allied to religion, and each lends support to the other. The history of philosophy is a reflection of social development and the class struggle. Just as there can be no neutrality in the political class struggle, so there can be none either in the war between idealism and materialism. Here too, there can be no such thing as a non-party standpoint, of the kind we have just noted in certain areas of science. The struggle between materialism and idealism therefore manifests itself, in Soviet opinion, throughout the whole history of philosophy. Social upheavals and the rise of new forms of society have always been accompanied by an intensification of the war of ideas. Thus the materialist philosophy of the French encyclopedists served as an intellectual prelude to the French Revolution. By contrast, the German idealist philosophy of Kant, Fichte, and Hegel is regarded by communism as an aristocratic reaction against the revolution. It was in Hegel's idealism, to be sure, that the dialectic so vital to communist ideology reached its highest point of development. But this difficulty is evaded by the presumption that it is possible to see in the Hegelian dialectic a reflection of the French Revolution, albeit of a mystificatory kind. As noted, the creation of dialectical materialism is regarded as a revolution in the development of philosophy, and the culmination of all man's philosophical endeavors to date. Dialectical and historical materialism is not to be regarded as the exclusive possession of a small intellectual elite. It seeks, rather, to express the world outlook of the working class and to serve the latter as a guide to the revolutionary transformation of the world. It claims to be a coherent scientific point of view and to find dazzling confirmation in science itself. Whereas the philosophy of the emergent bourgeoisie, and more especially the materialism of the 18th and 19th centuries, is acknowledged by communism to be progressive, contemporary bourgeois philosophy is held to be unmistakably decadent. It endeavors in all possible ways to individual forms of social consciousness. 253. Depreciate the value of human understanding. Irrationalism and mysticism have actually become the fashion. It is also characteristic that there should be a revival of the outlook of medieval scholasticism. Art. Like other forms of social consciousness, art also represents a reflection of reality. But in contrast to science, life and the world are here depicted, not in the form of concepts, but under the guise of imagery. The work of art makes use of what is individual to express typical features of reality. As a form of social consciousness, art belongs to the superstructure, is thus dependent on the socio-economic basis, and expresses the world outlook of some particular class. To reinforce this theory of the class character of art, Soviet ideology is happy to appeal to a remark of Chernyshevsky, a leader of the Russian revolutionary intelligentsia in the last century, to the effect that a nobleman and a peasant have each a different sense of beauty. Whereas the nobleman finds beauty in the delicacy, frailty, and pallor of a daughter of the aristocracy, the peasant sees it, rather, in the ample proportions of a sturdy apple-cheeked farm girl, glowing with vigor and health. As with any other form of the superstructure, art is not only a product of social life, but in turn has a reverse effect thereon. This may be either a progressive or a reactionary effect, depending on which class is served by the art in question. Bourgeois aesthetics will have it that the beautiful is the only object of art. Soviet ideology insists in reply that realistic art has at all times taken as its object, not the beautiful only, but the ugly and repulsive as well. We have only to think of such characters as Shakespeare's Lady Macbeth, or Kolstakov, and Sobakvik in Gogol. By depicting such types, art seeks to carry on the struggle against evil and social injustice. In admitting only the beautiful as the object of art, bourgeois aesthetics attempts to keep art away from criticism of the exploiter's society. In class society, factional interests, the class struggle and politics all exert an influence on art. And here too it is also subject to pressure from other ideological factors: religion, morality, science, and philosophy. Hence in analyzing a work of art one must always set out from the nature of the society that has produced it. Bourgeois writers on the subject maintain, indeed, that art leads a life of its own, independent of society and politics. But this is a lie. There is no such art, and never has been. Even the formalist campaign for pure art and the slogan "art for art's sake" perform a social function, in distracting the masses from the political struggle in the interests of the exploiting class. Yet despite their class character, Soviet aesthetic theory allows that the great masterpieces of realist art also embody aesthetic values of an enduring kind. It is admitted that the poetry of a Goethe or Pushkin, the music of Tchaikovsky or Beethoven, the paintings of Titian or Raphael, may furnish aesthetic satisfaction to different generations at different times. This is held possible because in the artistic depiction of reality, as in science, there are also elements of objective truth and an enduring worldly wisdom. Works which penetrate deep into reality and depict it in beautiful artistic form will never lose their value, even in later epochs. For at any time, social life, and the anti-reactionary struggles of progressive forces have more in them than the specific content applicable merely to their own epoch. They also contain much that is common to other periods. Moreover, the great art of the past was commonly directed against the powers of evil, against obsolete and reactionary influences, against social injustices, and thus has a powerful effect also upon those who struggle against capitalism in the 20th century. The enduring value of great masterpieces is also connected with their national and popular character. A work is national if it voices the hopes and aspirations of a people, expresses their demand for a just life, and assists the cause of liberation from social oppression. Soviet aesthetic theory is obliged, however, to admit that great and classical works of art always have some universal human appeal, whatever the class whose outlook they express. Such universal values include, for example, love, maternal care, friendship, comradeship, the struggle against injustice, heroism, resolution, etc. The evolution of art is not a random affair, but a lawfully unfolding process founded on the whole complicated evolution of society itself. Yet even Marx had to confess that art has by no means always flourished, most in periods when the material basis of society was at a high level of development. He instances the Great Age of Greece and the time of Shakespeare. Modern bourgeois art is accused by Soviet ideologists of having broken with the progressive heritage of the past, and of encouraging lack of principle, formalism, and anti-humanist ideas. 1 So far as major works have appeared under capitalism, there are other grounds for this. The greatest achievements belong to periods of social advance, when progressive forces have been struggling against serfdom and social oppression. The works of Raphael, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Shakespeare, Cervantes, Goethe, Gogol, Pushkin, Tolstoy, and others were an expression of protest against servitude and the moneybags of bourgeois exploitation. The working class, too, creates its own socialist art. This takes up the important task of educating the people in the spirit of communist ideas and forming the cultural pattern of Soviet man. It was in this sense that Stalin described Soviet authors as engineers of the soul. The method of this art is socialist realism. It is the promotion and advancement of the best traditions of realist art in the past and calls for a truthful, concretely historical, artistic presentation of reality in its revolutionary development. Art, too, is subject to the demand for partisanship. Socialist art workers see in the socialist ideology, the ideological leadership of the Communist Party, the most important condition for the development of art in a socialist society. Soviet authors and other art workers see it as their task, to reflect in lifelike artistic images the grandeur and beauty of the feats achieved by the labors of the people in its struggle for communism, to inspire the workers for communist construction by chastising the laggard and conservative elements in life, to educate the masses in the spirit of communist ideas, in implacable hostility to bourgeois ideology and its survivals, and to foster high moral qualities and aesthetic taste. 1. 4. Morality. Morality, for historical materialism, consists in the totality of norms governing the attitudes of men to one another, and to society. Law also has its norms, which regulate the communal life of men. The difference between them is that law has the sanction of state coercion behind it, whereas moral norms can rely only on public opinion, custom, and the inner convictions of the individual. Morality owes its origin to the social need for norms regulating the behavior of men to one another. Hence moral norms, on this view, are essentially social demands on individual behavior. In class society, morality has a class character, that is, it expresses the interests of a specific class. The dominant morality is that of the ruling class. The exploiter's morality is held to be supported by religion and imposed through the churches, the schools, the press, and the overall living conditions of the oppressed. But the latter also work out moral principles of their own. Morality, too, belongs to the superstructure, and is a reflection in social consciousness of the material living conditions of society. As the basis changes, so also do the moral principles of men. This, so Engels informs us, can go so far that the conceptions of good and evil may directly contradict one another from one epoch to the next. Even such injunctions as "thou shalt not steal" are not by any means eternal and unchanging moral precepts. For in communist society, the final stage of social evolution, where there will be no more private ownership of commodities, and where consumer goods will be available in such abundance that society can provide for everyone according to his needs, the inducement to theft will no longer exist, and the precept will thus fall into abeyance. In contemporary society there are two systems of morality, the bourgeois and the proletarian. The principle typical of the former is that of individualism and egoism. A morality of this type leads every man to regard his fellow as an object of use and a means for attaining his ends. According to communism, it is the morality of homo homini lupus. This individualist and egoistic character of bourgeois morality is due to the dependence of bourgeois society on private property. Nor, in communist eyes, does a religious morality represent any advance over the egoism of bourgeois morality. Even if religion endeavors to subdue egoism, it cannot succeed in this, if only because its own main concern, namely personal salvation, is an equally individualist affair. Communist morality, on the other hand, is typically governed by the principle of collectivism. This implies, in the first place, a negative conquest of the individualist point of view. Communist morality is able to do this because it is the morality of the class which is committed to doing away with private property and erecting a society based on social ownership. The principle of collectivism also implies the formation of a positive attitude of solidarity and cooperation, mutual aid, and the subordination of personal to social interests. This attitude is shaped in the struggle against exploitation and on behalf of a new order of society. As to the question of the criterion whereby we are ultimately to decide what must be ranked as good or bad, Lenin has already laid it down that our morality is entirely subordinated to the interests of the class struggle of the proletariat. In full accord with this Leninist precept, contemporary Soviet opinion also holds the highest standard of human conduct to be the struggle for the new social order of communism. Duty and conscience, even, are attemptedly derived from this struggle. From the conditions and needs of this struggle there arise the obligations of members of society, that is, their duty, and in it is formed their conscience, that is the consciousness of moral responsibility for their behavior, for the fate of other men, for the fate of the motherland and mankind. For the substantive requirements of communist morality are to be found in the following moral code of the builder of communism set forth in the new Soviet Communist Party program adopted at the 22nd Party Congress: devotion to the communist cause, love of the socialist motherland and of the other socialist countries, conscientious labor for the good of society. He who does not work, neither shall he eat, concern on the part of everyone for the preservation and growth of public wealth, a high sense of public duty, intolerance of actions harmful to the public interest, collectivism and comradely mutual assistance, one for all and all for one. Humane relations and mutual respect between individuals. Man is to man a friend, comrade, and brother, honesty and truthfulness, moral purity, modesty and unpretentiousness in social and private life, mutual respect in the family, and concern for the upbringing of children, an uncompromising attitude to injustice, parasitism, dishonesty, careerism, and money grubbing, friendship and brotherhood among all peoples of the USSR, intolerance of national and racial hatred, an uncompromising attitude to the enemies of communism, peace and the freedom of nations, fraternal solidarity with the working people of all countries, and with all peoples. Finally, we have a repudiation of the charge that communist morality is a denial of all previous morality. Communism, so it is newly emphasized, is far from disputing the presence of universally human moral values even in earlier ages. In the morality of progressive classes in those days there was already a positive content expressing the interests of the masses of the people. This content will not become outmoded in times to come. The creator of these enduring moral values has always been the people, especially in epochs when it has been fighting for its freedom and the great interests of society. Communist morality is the highest stage in the moral progress of mankind, and carries forward the whole moral legacy of previous ages. Since it is the morality of the working class, under whose leadership the masses of the people are to free themselves forever from exploitation and oppression, it is in essence a universal morality. The admission of universal human moral norms is also set out in the new party program. Communist morality encompasses the fundamental norms of human morality which the masses of the people evolved in the course of millenniums as they fought against vice and social oppression. The revolutionary morality of the working class is of particular importance to the moral advancement of society. As socialist and communist construction progresses, communist morality is enriched with new principles, a new content. V. Religion. In our exposition of the forms of social consciousness so far dealt with, it has repeatedly been evident that in communist opinion they occur in the class society in a merely distorted form. It is only in the classless society that they will emerge in complete purity. But even in class society they already contained, for all their deformities, a number of universal human values of an enduring kind. The case is altered, for Marxism-Leninism, when it comes to religion. It is an ideological form that represents in essence a fantastical, illusory, and perverted reflection of reality in human consciousness. Religion implies here a belief in supernatural, fantastical, unreal beings. According to this view, religion owes its origin to the feeling of helplessness on the part of primitive man in the face of natural forces. Since man was not in a position to subdue these forces, he attempted to placate them with prayers, conjurations, and sacrifices. Religious convictions, and the corresponding social institutions, belong to the superstructure, but only in primitive and class society. The socialist economic basis no longer gives birth to a religious superstructure. The religions and religious institutions that still in fact persist under socialism are thus to be regarded only as survivals from the capitalist era. The role of religion is a reactionary one. With its otherworldly beliefs it provides a convenient means in the hands of the exploiters for keeping the oppressed masses in subjection, by holding out hopes of a better life hereafter. Marx took over from Feuerbach the idea that it was not God who created man, but man who made God in his own image and likeness. But he also sought to outdo Feuerbach by explaining why man should create, in religion, an illusory world. His explanation was that owing to inner contradictions in the present order, human society is in dire distress. The terrestrial sphere can only leave its own moorings, and rise into the clouds as a self-sufficient kingdom of heaven, insofar as it is internally divided and rent with contradictions. Social life, by the same token, is not, as idealists and theologians would have us believe, a copy of some ideal religious reality. On the contrary, religious notions are nothing more than a reflection of the corresponding material conditions of social life. Thus when men create gods in their imagination, they project upon them their own human characteristics. The gods work, eat, drink, quarrel among themselves, love and hate, and even seduce men's wives. We are told of this, not only in the religions of ancient Egypt, Babylon, and Greece, but also in the Bible and the Christian Gospels. Since religion belongs to the superstructure, it reflects the socio-economic development of society. In primitive society, according to historical materialism, every gens had its own deities. When, in course of time, the gentes amalgamated into tribes, and tribes into nations, there was a similar amalgamation of gods and the formation of a hierarchical chain of authority among them. The rise of monotheistic religion was governed, says Engels, by the emergence of Oriental despotism. Changes in the current socio-economic structure are also said to be reflected in the history of Christianity. Christendom arose out of the need of the Roman Empire for a single world. Religion. Its inception dates from the time of the decline of the Roman slave society, when the contradictions between slaves and slave owners were becoming most acute. Primitive Christianity originated as a religion of the slaves and the oppressed, the disinherited, and the plebeian. It started as a mass movement in the eastern provinces of the empire, and was typically marked, say the Soviet writers, by the presence of a variety of groups, circles, and tendencies. Common to them all was a belief in the miraculous birth, the martyrdom, and resurrection of a new deity, Christ. In what Soviet ideology regards as the esoteric revelation, that is, the oldest literary record, which it dates around the year 69, there are expressions of bitter hatred against Rome, and an expectation of the impending collapse of the empire and an end of the world, in which Christ will again appear on earth to do justice and settle accounts with the oppressors. In the struggle among the various movements in early Christianity, these rebellious impulses did not, however, prevail. Victory went, rather, to those who preached a patient bearing of the cross. The image of Christ came increasingly to be that of the suffering Savior our God, especially in the Gospels, which Soviet authors date from the first half of the 2nd century. But Christianity thereby began to transform itself from an ideology of the oppressed into an ideology of the oppressors. The exhortations to patience and submission, the pretended hopes of happiness in the hereafter, converted Christianity into an effective tool in the hands of the exploiters, whereby to keep the slaves and the impoverished in a state of subjection. In the feudal period, the image and function of Christianity underwent a change. The hierarchical structure of feudal society also brought out more sharply in Christianity the heavenly hierarchy, with its saints, angels, and archangels, at whose summit stood the heavenly king. The church became a pillar of feudalism and itself evolved into a powerful feudal authority. Even the class struggle of the serfs and town plebeians against the feudal lords took a religious form, in the shape of insurrections on the part of heretics and sectaries against the established church. There was a religious aspect also to the early bourgeois revolutions. The French Revolution was the first to exhibit a markedly political character and to carry on a simultaneous struggle against church and religion in the name of atheism. But so far as religion has been able to this day, not only to survive into the age of capitalism, but actually to play a large part in it, the reasons, in Soviet opinion, are as follows: the anarchy of the capitalist mode of production, with the result that man still has no control over the laws of social development, so that they appear to him as alien, supernatural forces, before which he feels himself helpless, the social pressure weighing upon the masses of the people, and the fact that the exploiting classes use every conceivable means of promoting religion, in order to hold the masses in check? Since communism regards religion as essentially a false representation of the real, and hence as an instrument of exploitation, its attitude is one of bitter opposition. Lenin calls the struggle against religion the ABC of all materialism, and consequently of Marxism. Yet the fight, so he holds, should not be carried on initially by an attempt at ideological enlightenment or by police measures, but rather by eliminating, through the abolition of exploitation, the social roots from which it grows. Engels described religion as a private matter. Lenin and his present-day Soviet followers insist, however, that this holds only from the standpoint of the state, not from that of the party. If the state regards religion as a private matter, that implies primarily a separation of church and state. Every citizen should be at liberty to subscribe to this religion or that, or to atheism. But this does not prevent the party from imposing on all its members the duty of an active struggle against religion. Since socialism is held to be already in effect in the USSR, the social roots of religion no longer exist there. Insofar as survivals of religion still persist actively in many minds, this is attributed to the fact that, even under socialism, men continue up to a point to be subject to the elemental forces of nature, and so long as there is still a capitalist camp, there is always the danger of war. Both natural catastrophes and the risk of war are a source of anxiety, but religion has always fed upon anxiety. Since the social roots of religion no longer exist in the USSR, the struggle against it now requires to be carried on mainly through scientific atheistic propaganda. 6. Criticism. Our previous chapter confined itself to criticism of the Soviet theory of social consciousness on general grounds. After the basic objections made in Chapter 2 against the whole doctrine of basis and superstructure, and the further objections in our last against the class dependence of social consciousness in particular, it would really be superfluous to enter once more upon what Soviet ideology has to say of the individual forms of such consciousness, of science, philosophy, art, etc. For all such assertions presuppose the materialist conception of history, and once this foundation has been shaken, they automatically cease to be valid. It may yet be worthwhile, however, to append a few brief remarks to our earlier discussion, apropos of the individual forms of social consciousness. What has so far been stated in general terms may thereby acquire a greater vividness and life. So far as the Soviet view of science is concerned, we find two different sets of statements in direct and uncompromising opposition to each other. On the one hand, it is acknowledged that science builds up from one generation to another an ever-increasing store of objective, universally valid truths which are unaffected by changes in the mode of production. But this does not prevent the Soviet ideologists from maintaining in the same breath that not only the social, but even the natural sciences are class-conditioned, and from speaking of a class war in science, of partisanship in science, etc. When the accusation is leveled at so-called bourgeois science that capitalist monopolies subordinate scientific research to their own interests, it might be asked in return whether science in the Soviet Union is not harnessed to the practical interests of power politics. And if a detailed inquiry were to be instituted, as to whether the East or the West does more research of a pure kind, i.e., without reference to immediate practical needs, the communist East would probably come off very badly. Lastly, when allegations are made concerning persecution of scientists in the West, there is no discovering what concrete instances in recent times are thereby referred to. Yet it was only some 20 years ago in the Soviet Union that the world-renowned geneticist N.S. Vavilov was supplanted by Michurin and the new Soviet theory of inheritance, and died in banishment in Siberia. And it was only quite recently, in the summer of 1959, that Khrushchev raised objections, in the June plenum of the Party Central Committee, to the appointment of Professor Dubinin, the chief opponent of Lysenko, to directorship of the newly established Institute of Cytology and Genetics in Novosibirsk. As regards philosophy, we have already had occasion in Part I to state our opinion of the forcible division of all systems of philosophy into the two main camps of idealism and materialism. The necessity of pressing all systems into the service of one or other of these factions is doubtless imposed on Soviet ideology by the fact that philosophy has to reflect the class struggle, and that historical materialism never sees more than two main classes at any time, whose contention sets the seal upon a given epoch. As to the hymns of praise that are sounded in this connection on behalf of dialectical materialism, they call for no further comment, after the detailed analysis of this philosophy in Part I of the present work. The dilemma confronting the Soviet official doctrine in regard to the class character of ideologies is perhaps most clearly evident in the sphere of art theory. On the one hand, there is supposed to be no art independent of politics; on the other, the classic masterpieces are said to embody enduring values and objective truth, no matter the class from which they may have sprung. But this is to abandon, in practice, the formula of basis and superstructure. For if even something in art is not class-conditioned, the relations of production are no longer ultimate determinants for the whole cultural life of society, but only govern something therein. And if it be maintained that in no society has art ever had so much encouragement from the state as it has in the Soviet Union and people's democracies, this is quite obviously to disregard what was done for the arts by popes and princes in the past. The communist ethic represents an abortive attempt to overcome relativism and social utilitarianism by the admission of universal moral values. When it is argued in the first place that morality belongs to the superstructure, and is a reflection of the material conditions of life in society, this is sheer relativism. What is good at one time may be bad at another, and vice versa. But it thereupon becomes meaningless for communism to do what it is said to have been doing since Marx's time, namely to carry on the struggle against bourgeois society by means of ethical arguments accusing it of unjust exploitation, and campaigning against it in the name of social justice. For to act in this fashion would imply an admission of the existence, outside the two social forms of capitalism and communism, of norms binding on both, and from whose standpoint capitalism can be condemned as unjust. The class-conditioned character of morality is, however, interpreted by communism in a different sense, even though it nowhere expressly says so. It seeks to maintain, not that a thing literally sevens both good and bad at different times, but that it is considered so, and it tacitly assumes that what capitalism holds good and bad should not be so esteemed from an objective point of view. Thus the new party program tells us that communism makes the elementary standards of morality and justice, which were distorted or shamelessly flouted under the rule of the exploiters, inviolable rules for relations both between individuals and between peoples. This implies, however, that there are objective norms for good and evil, to which capitalism and communism are alike subject, and the whole problem becomes one of establishing what is good and bad, and why. But if so, it is no longer in order to maintain that there are no eternal moral laws. In any case, the argument whereby communism attempts to prove that there are no such eternal laws of morality is a crude misunderstanding. If the precept "thou shalt not steal" were indeed to fall into abeyance under communism, because there is no longer any inducement to theft, this would not entail that the moral law in question had lost its objective validity, but merely that it had ceased to be in any danger of violation. We have just noticed how communism tacitly assumes that there are objective and universally valid norms of good and evil. And in the latest elaboration of its ethic, as expounded in Fundamentals of Marxist Philosophy, it is admitted in so many words that there are universal moral values common to all mankind. What then is to be regarded as the norm of good and evil? In answering this question, the communist ethic betrays its inadequacy. For the supreme principle of good and evil is asserted to be the struggle for communism and the new order of society. But this cannot possibly be the supreme principle, if only because the struggle itself is conducted in the name of justice, and it still remains to be decided what is just and what not, and why anything is to be reckoned either one or the other. Of the individual moral injunctions we may say that in them the communist ethic certainly has nothing new to offer. Their main purport would seem to be the conquest of egoism, but this is so far from novelty that communism is here in fact following in the footsteps of Christianity. If it imagines that it will actually be quicker to conquer egoism, by abolishing the source thereof in private property, the reply must be that egoism is not expressed in covetousness alone. Another manifestation of egoism, which may also make itself felt in a society without private property, would be, for example, the avoidance of a disagreeable job. And the Soviet press is in fact full of complaints about shirkers and idlers. Nor do the individual precepts of communist morality, respect for others, neighborliness, honesty, etc., and in particular sexual morality, show any advance over Christian ethics. It is amusing to note in this connection how Konstantinov credits Lenin with having formulated the principle, "He who does not work, neither shall have philosophy of religion." Is a discrepancy in the treatment of this special form of social consciousness, as compared with the others. Religion is viewed as an ideological form which in essence reflects reality in a distorted fashion, whereas the others only do so in a class society, and in the classless society of socialism and communism will reach their full development in a purified form. But now how can we envisage a form of social consciousness that is essentially doomed to retail an inverted view of the real? If religion is truly a form of social consciousness, and if the various forms of this are characterized by the fact that they reproduce a variety of aspects and facets of the real one, then it should really be admitted that even religion reflects a particular aspect of reality, and that hence, like all other ideologies, it is destined to attain its purest realization in the classless society. But in fact the very opposite is supposed to happen, namely that religion disappears altogether. How can such a discrepancy be justified? Communism credits religion with a reactionary role, in that by holding out hopes of a better life hereafter it becomes a valuable tool in the hands of the exploiters, to divert the exploited from recognition of their rights in this world. But this is to overlook the fact that religion preaches, not only humility and patience, but also justice. It makes men aware that they are answerable to an eternal judge, and puts them in mind of the sanctions awaiting them hereafter. If we read the account of the Last Judgment in St. Matthew's Gospel, we are struck by the fact that here men are judged solely by their behavior towards their fellow men. "I was an hungered, and ye gave me no meat, sick, and in prison, and ye visited me not." Again, the parable of the rich glutton and Lazarus in St. Luke has the aim of recalling men urgently to the responsibility they take upon themselves, when they remain indifferent to the lot of their fellow men. Registered. But now if religion belongs to the superstructure, and is supposed to reflect the socio-economic development of society, how are we to explain the fact that in one and the same society there are many religions, and again that one and the same religion may outlast the span of many social formations? Christianity has existed under slavery, feudalism, and capitalism, and even in the socialist society of the Soviet Union has not only not disappeared, but has actually revived in recent years, to the great annoyance of the party. In order to account for this, Soviet ideology is obliged to take refuge in speculations of the most adventurous kind. Christ, though he never wearied of protesting in his lifetime that his kingdom was not of this world, is transformed into a social revolutionary. As regards the chronology of the scriptures, Soviet ideology pursues a theory that was fashionable in the second halt of the last century, namely the higher criticism of the New Testament, which is now regarded as completely outmoded and displaced by the findings of more recent research. The only historical sources admitted are polemical writings directed against Christianity, while the scriptures themselves are denied to have any historical value whatever. Christianity is held to have originated as a religion of slaves and underdogs, though in the struggle among the various Christian groups the eventual winners are said to have been those who permitted the gospel to become a weapon in the hands of the exploiters. A scientific world outlook of this description no longer has any kinship with science. Part 3. The Political Economy of Capitalism. Introduction. The primary source for contemporary Soviet economic theory is the textbook Political Economy. Nearly 15 years were spent on the preparation of this book. Before publication it was subjected to a broadly based discussion among the Soviet experts. Stalin himself intervened in this, with the last piece of abstract writing he produced, under the title Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR. One, however, The textbook only appeared after his death, and already incorporated some of the views of his successors. A second revised edition followed in the autumn of 1955, and a third, on which the present short account is based, at the end of 1959. This currently approved treatise on Soviet political economy runs to some 700 pages. The first half is devoted to the exposition of capitalism and imperialism, and the second to the political economy of socialism. Interestingly enough, the contemporaneous fundamentals of Marxism-Leninism is concerned in its economic portion solely with the political economy of capitalism and deals with the theoretical economics of socialism and communism in conjunction with the political doctrines relating thereto. We shall follow this division in our own account, though in treating of the theory itself we shall also refer to the textbook on political economy. Soviet ideology defines political economy as the science of the development of the social productive, economic, relations between men. It elucidates the laws which regulate the production and distribution of material wealth in human society at the different stages of its development. Political economy only inquires into the social side of production. The technical aspects must be left to technology and the natural sciences. Political economy is described as a historical science because it investigates the historically conditioned social forms of material production. Its task is to discover the economic laws peculiar to the corresponding mode of production. Every social order is characterized, in Soviet opinion, by a series of economic laws established by specific circumstances independent of man's will, and beyond his power to create, alter, or remove. Soviet political economy marks itself off sharply from all other economic theories. The Soviet view is that classical bourgeois economics arose with the emergence of the bourgeoisie in the 16th and 17th centuries. Special prominence is given to the names of William Petty, Adam Smith and David Ricardo. They made a number of important discoveries, though owing to their bourgeois class limitations they did not succeed in recognizing and uncovering the contradictions of capitalism. This was achieved for the first time in Marxian political economy. Since the labors of Marx and Engels, bourgeois political economy has been marked by a decline, in Soviet opinion. Its task has been simply the justification of capitalism. Soviet political economy expressly avows the principle of partisanship. In the textbook of political economy, economics is described as a powerful weapon of ideas in the hands of the working class and of all working mankind in their struggle for emancipation from capitalist oppression. The Soviet political economy of capitalism consists of two parts. The first is concerned with pre-monopoly capitalism, 1.e. capitalism up to the time of the emergence of imperialism at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries. This part reproduces in abbreviated and propagandist form the content of the first volume of Marx's Capital. Here and there we also find reference to the second and third volumes of this work. There are likewise occasional allusions to Marx's critique of political economy, his posthumous economic manuscripts, and the economic portions of Engels' Anti-Die-Ring. The second part is concerned with imperialism, which superseded pre-monopoly capitalism around the turn of the century. Tuesday, edbk. The account of imperialism relies on Lenin's treatise, Extended Reproduction is Not Possible. Owing to the unplanned and anarchic character of the capitalist mode of production, this necessary equilibrium of extended reproduction can, however, only come about through economic crises, and then only for a relatively short time. Vil. Economic crises. The aim of capitalist production, the maximizing of profit, inevitably comes into collision with the means to this end, namely the extension of production. In the effort to maximize profit, production is extended, technology improved, new machinery introduced, and enormous quantities of goods are thrown on the market. But the result is to increase the proportion of constant capital, which produces no surplus value, as against the variable capital, which does. The rate of profit falls. The entrepreneurs endeavor to compensate for this fall by increasing production. But such an extension runs up unchecked against the narrow limits to consumption, the incapacity of the market to keep in step with the expansion. The mass of products flooding the market can no longer be bought by the consumers, the crisis begins. Crises, in Soviet opinion, are thus an inevitable feature of the capitalist mode of production. They recur at regular intervals, about every 8 to 12 years. After the first of them, others followed in all advanced countries, at least in 1836, 1847 to 48, 1857, 1866, 1873, 1882, 1890, 1900-03, 1907, 1920-21, the world crisis of 1929-33, and 1937-38. After the Second World War, the Soviets reckon that new crises occurred in 1948-49, 1953-54, and 1957-58. A crisis is a constituent element of the capitalist economic cycle, and consists of 4 phases. 1. The crisis. This is the phase in which a contradiction appears between the expansion of production and a relative contraction of demand. The overproduction of goods, which find no purchaser, leads to a piling up of stocks in the warehouses. A violent fall in prices is the result. A severe shortage of means of payment makes itself felt. Credit arrangements break down. Small and medium-sized producers in town and country are ruined in a wave of bankruptcies. Unemployment grows. The workers still employed in production see their wages decline. By the ruin of many entrepreneurs, the crisis effects a violent adjustment of the scale of production to demand. The crises are always but momentary and forcible solutions of the existing contradictions, violent eruptions, which restore the disturbed equilibrium for a while. 2. The depression. The phase of the cycle immediately following the crisis, in which are established the preconditions for the ensuing recovery and boom. The intensity of labor is increased, mechanical re-equipment takes place, so as to be able to dispose of goods profitably at lower prices. Enterprises which manufacture machinery and equipment recover and obtain orders. Their renewed activity again has a reviving effect on other branches of industry. 3. The recovery. The phase in which enterprises recover from the crisis, production regains its earlier level, and the rate of profit again improves. 4. The boom. The phase in which production has again reached, and may surpass, the old, pre-crisis levels. New undertakings are set up, prices rise, production expands, and the preconditions are established for the next crisis of overproduction. Thus every crisis, as Marx sees it, is already laying the foundation for a new one. Vil. The accumulation of capital n. The impoverishment of the proletariat. The accumulation of capital is described by the Soviet ideologists as the addition of part of the surplus value to capital, or the transformation of part of the surplus value into capital. It is a precondition for the extended reproduction referred to above. For the latter involves application of part of the surplus value to acquiring additional means of production and hiring additional workers. In so doing, the proportion of constant capital increases far more quickly, in Marxist opinion, than that of variable capital, the portion of capital employed to acquire labor power. This is the reason for the fact that, parallel to the accumulation of capital, there is a relative decline in the demand for labor power, despite the increase in total numbers of the proletariat that accompanies the development of capitalism. The consequence of this is that a large number of workers can find no outlet for their labor. They form an industrial reserve army, the army of the unemployed, a necessary appendage of the capitalist economy, without which it could not exist. It keeps these reserves of labor power at its disposal for periods of industrial boom. Hence the accumulation of capital brings it about that, hand in hand with the concentration of wealth at one pole of society, there goes an intensification of exploitation, unemployment, and misery at the other. This is the general law of capitalist accumulation. This worsening of the workers' condition is exhibited, say the Soviet writers, in the process of relative and absolute impoverishment of the proletariat. Relative impoverishment consists in the fact that the income of the capitalist entrepreneur increases more rapidly than the worker's wage. The share of the wage worker in national income steadily decreases while the share of the entrepreneur steadily grows. From this it is concluded that the gulf widens between the growing wealth and luxury of the exploiting upper stratum of society and the living standards of the worker. Lenin repeatedly insisted on the thesis of relative impoverishment. The growth of social wealth proceeds side by side with the growth of social inequality. The gulf between the class of property owners and the class of the proletariat is growing. An example of this brought forward in Soviet publications is that the proportion of workers' wages to entrepreneurial income in the USA has sunk from 69% to 61%, 48%, and finally to 45%. In Fundamentals of Marxism-Leninism it is expressly emphasized that relative impoverishment continues to operate even if there is actually a certain rise in the wage level. The increased intensity of labor and the greater efforts needed in the labor process require better food and medical attention. So far as these greater demands, in the interests of reproducing labor power, are not met, or only partially so, the position of the working class worsens, at least relatively, even when a few feeble wage increases are obtained. In addition to relative impoverishment there is also, as the Soviets see it, an absolute impoverishment of the working class, 2 cent. An absolute decline in the standard of living. The worker is becoming impoverished absolutely, 1 cent. He is actually becoming poorer than before, he is compelled to live worse, to eat worse, to suffer hunger more, and to live in basements and attics. Wealth in capitalist society is growing at an incredible rate side by side with the impoverishment of the mass of the workers, for in Soviet sources of recent origin there are, however, different versions of what is meant by absolute impoverishment, and how far it has gone at the present day. In the first edition of the textbook of political economy, the foregoing statement of Lenin's was quoted, with the assertion that absolute impoverishment was still in full swing to this day. It is expressed in the fall in real wages, the growing amount and duration of unemployment, the deterioration of working conditions, the increase in industrial accidents, the worsening of the workers' living and housing conditions, and the rise in the death rate of the working class. The textbook expressly declares in the 20th century, real wages of workers in England, the United States, France, Italy, and other capitalist countries are lower than they were in the middle of the 19th century. In these conned Russian edition of the book, Lenin is still quoted, but it is no longer claimed that real wages are lower today than in the 19th century. In the third edition, we find for the first time no further talk of a law, but merely of a process of absolute impoverishment. Lenin's assertion on the subject falls victim to the censor, and so too does the claim that present-day wages are lower than in the mid-19th century. The symptoms of absolute impoverishment are likewise abbreviated and watered down. It is now merely argued that the fall in living standards finds expression in the increased intensity of labor and the deterioration of working conditions, since the greater expenditure of physical and nervous energy is not compensated by an additional rise in wages. Industrial accidents are also on the increase. The following qualification is added: real wages are not the only index of the worker's living standards. His position may deteriorate, though real wages remain unchanged, or even rise somewhat. The process of absolute impoverishment should not be regarded as constant and universal, as a decrease in the working people's living standards continuing from year to year, week to week, and day to day. The worker's living standard can certainly rise at given periods of capitalist development, in this country or that, or in several countries, even though it is generally falling in the capitalist world economy as a whole. Still more cautious and hesitant is the formulation of the erstwhile law of workers' impoverishment set forth in Fundamentals of Marxism-Leninism, which appeared at the end of 1959. Here it is expressly stated that it is a matter not of a law, nor even of a process, but merely of a tendency of capitalism, which is realized unevenly in different countries and periods owing to deviations and irregularities. The new textbook refrains from giving any examples of absolute impoverishment, and actually rejects the claims formerly made. Only by misrepresentation can it be claimed that according to the theory of Marx and Lenin the standard of living of the workers of all capitalist countries should be lower today than, say, at the turn of the century. 9. The historical tendency of capitalist development. The operation of the immanent laws of capitalism leads, in the Soviet view, to a situation where capital and means of production become concentrated within an ever-diminishing circle of capitalists. This process occurs by way of the concentration and centralization of capital. Concentration of capital is enlargement of the capital of a single undertaking, the growth in the size of capital as a result of the accumulation of surplus value obtained in the given enterprise. Centralization of capital is growth in the size of capital as a result of fusing several capitals into one larger capital. In consequence of the competitive struggle, the weaker enterprises are ruined. They are swallowed up and annexed by the larger ones. Centralization, 7 cent. The fusing of many capitals into one, also goes on by the formation of partnerships, joint stock companies, etc. Concentration and centralization of capital, both processes, incidentally, are described as laws create the conditions, in Soviet opinion, for the collapse of capitalism and the transition from capitalism to socialism. Technical progress leads to an ever more extensive application of science to production. The means of production develop to such a degree that they can no longer be controlled and employed by individuals or groups, but only by society as a whole. The moment approaches when it is not merely possible, but actually necessary, to turn over the crucial means of production to social ownership. Only so is it possible to overcome the contradiction, now at its peak, between the social character of production and private economic appropriation. Concentration and centralization of capital not only create these objective preconditions for the transition to socialism, they also create subjective conditions as well. Their outcome is to concentrate the wealth of society in the hands of an ever smaller number of persons. The gulf between the small minority of capitalists and the majority of the working population becomes greater still. The concentration of production simultaneously brings it about that the workers become concentrated in increasing numbers in large capitalist undertakings and industrial centers. This facilitates the welding together of the workers and their organization against the capitalist system. The contradiction between the capitalist system of production and the increasingly expansive productive forces of society becomes ever more apparent. Capitalist monopoly becomes a fetter upon the method of production which has flourished with it and under it. The centralization of the means of production and the socialism of labor reach a point where they prove incompatible with their capitalist husk. This bursts asunder. The knell of capitalist private property sounds. The expropriators are expropriated. These concluding words from the first volume of Marx's Capital are referred to in all the accepted texts of Soviet ideology as the historical tendency of capitalism. In the new fundamentals of Marxism-Leninism it is stated that the necessity for the revolutionary transformation of capitalist society is not founded on utopian aspirations, but wholly and exclusively on the objective laws of capitalist development. This development inevitably leads to the revolutionary transformation from capitalist to socialist society. The general law of capitalist accumulation is the economic explanation of the necessity and inevitability of the proletarian revolution. XX. Criticism. The Soviet account of pre-monopoly capitalism is an attempt to demonstrate that the latter is doomed to collapse in virtue of its own internal contradictions. And this, indeed, is plainly said. The economic teaching of Marx and Engels provides a thorough and comprehensive proof of the inevitability of the downfall of capitalism. Soviet ideology endeavors here to create the impression that the conclusions drawn by Marx from his analysis of West European capitalism in the middle of the last century, still retain their general validity unaltered to this day. What is deliberately passed over is that Marx could only build upon the practical experience and theoretical knowledge of his own time, a period in which the living and working conditions of the laborer were appalling, and the introduction of a 10-hour working day was hailed as a great advance. in which there was no social or labor legislation to speak of, the trade unions were only just commencing activity, the parliamentary spokesman of the working class could exert little or no influence, and state intervention in matters of economics and planning was still anathema to the liberalism of the day, a period in which even the analysis of economic processes was still in its infancy, statistical data were scarcely to be had, and the theory of value on which Marx based his theory still held universal and almost uncontested sway. But now, a century later, to put forward these theories of Marx as Soviet ideology does as irrefutable truths about capitalism in general, is not only to ignore the changes of an entire century, but also to do an ill service to the scientific achievements of Marx himself. The capitalist system has shown itself far more multifarious, versatile, and adaptable than even the greatest genius could have foreseen in the middle of the 19th century. A number of Marxian theses have thus become wholly outmoded, while others are in need of revision. Thus the labor theory of value is no longer acceptable to present-day economic thought. For Marx, the only thing that all commodities, however diverse, have in common, is the fact that they are products of human labor. But this will not do. A number of other such common properties can be found in them, for instance, the power of serving as a means to the satisfaction of some human want. If the value of an article is determined by the labor time socially necessary for its production, how comes it that the value of a wine increases merely through the length of time it has been laid down? Interestingly enough, Engels had already observed this, shortly before his death. In a letter to Conrad Schmidt, dated March 1895, he pointed out that the labor theory of value was a concept, and like any other concept, cannot coincide with reality. But the Marxian theory of value and surplus value has encountered its most serious troubles over the question of the average rate of profit. Since Engels published the third volume of Capital, it is here that the evidence has most generally been seen of a basic contradiction between the first volume and the third. In volume I, Marx had taught that only variable capital creates surplus value. Hence, the larger the proportion of variable to constant capital in an enterprise, the greater must be the surplus value, and thus the profit. In volume 3 Marx now tells us that capitals of equal value bring in a more or less equal profit, regardless of their organic composition. This implies, however, that variable capitals of the same size may bring in a different profit, so that the size of the latter is not solely governed by the variable capital. In the law of the equalization of the rate of profit, however, Marx describes just what actually goes on in a capitalist economy. If his law of value were correct, and it was only the variable capital that created value and surplus value, an average rate of profit could only come about if all undertakings exhibited a more or less equal, optimal combination of constant and variable capital, which is not in fact the case. Hence value and surplus value are created, not only by variable, but by constant capital as well. If it were true that surplus value and profit were solely produced by variable capital, it would follow, furthermore, that the process of impoverishment would not only afflict the workers, but also the capitalists, in like fashion. For owing to technical progress, and especially to automation, the proportion of constant to variable capital is constantly on the increase. But if the proportion of variable capital is constantly declining, so too must surplus value and profit. Soviet political economy does as a matter of fact teach that the rate of profit has a steady tendency to diminish. This can be temporarily slowed down only by a continuous increase in the exploitation of the working class, by the pressure of rising unemployment on the labor market, so that the worker becomes ready to hire himself to the exploiters for any wage he can get, by the capitalist economizing on hygienic measures and industrial and accident protection, at the expense of the worker's life and health, etc. But tales of this sort can be told only to Soviet workers, who have no opportunity of checking the truth of such allegations on the spot. The anarchic character of production and exchange, of which Marx made so much, has likewise altered in the meantime in many respects. Even the most liberal state, under the capitalist system nowadays, reserves the right to frequent intervention in the planning field, in distributing income and fixing prices, in policies of credit and full employment, in exports and imports, and in the procurement of raw materials. A further word needs to be said about this alleged anarchy of production. Soviet ideology attributes it to the fact that conditions of supply and demand are unknown to any producer beforehand, so that they merely coincide by chance, as the result of constant fluctuations. There is nothing chancy, however, about the operation of the market. On the contrary, it is the simplest, cheapest, and most convenient method of coordinating supply and demand, far simpler, less costly, and more effective than the unwieldy apparatus of a central planning commission. Even the drawback insisted on by communist propaganda, that the competitive struggle brings small producers to ruin, and compels them to live by selling their labor power, can be very largely obviated by appropriate social legislation, and actually is so. If this does not suffice to remove all hardships, there is certainly more humanity in a social order of this kind, where there is a legislative effort to protect the small producer, even if it does not succeed in every case when compared with a society whose legislative aim is to ruin all independent producers without distinction, and to turn them into wage laborers of the one and only employer, the state. The polarization of society that Marx expected, into a constantly diminishing stratum of ever more opulent capitalists, on the one hand, and a constantly more impecunious stratum of workers on the other, with the middle class eventually disintegrating entirely, might perhaps have laid claim to some measure of probability in his own day. For the small commodity producers were in fact subject to frequent absorption by large capitalist enterprises. But as noted above, it has turned out that even a high degree of concentration in the major industries cannot dispense with small and middle-grade tributary enterprises, a fact that has often led to the development of new concerns of this type. Moreover, the major industries, and the ever more complex apparatus of economic control, have need of a large staff of engineers, technicians, supervisors, and functionaries, so that the middle classes can not only hold their own in point of numbers, but can grow and increase their influence. Marx's theory of crises, whose importance is acknowledged today even by non-Marxist economists, was for many decades confirmed by the cyclical recurrence of economic recessions. In the meantime, however, even the bourgeois economies have developed a whole series of measures to regulate the cycle of boom and depression. The Marxian theory of impoverishment, whereby, as capitalism develops, the condition of the worker deteriorates, has not been verified. The trade unions and workers' parties that have arisen in the interval, their growing influence and increasing power, have not only countered such a tendency, but have led, in all industrial countries of the capitalist world, to a marked rise in the general standard of living. To prevent misunderstanding, there is one more thing that needs saying about this whole Marxian analysis of capitalism. There can be no disputing that capitalism makes it possible for one man to appropriate the property of another, and that it is right and proper to campaign for the establishment of a social order in which this possibility is excluded. But the question at issue here is whether Marx's theories, and in particular his doctrine of value and surplus value, together with the subsidiary theories of accumulation, impoverishment, and collapse, are scientifically tenable, and whether he has thereby set forth the internal laws of motion of capitalism, as necessarily leading to the establishment of a socialist order of society. And this it is proper to dispute. 2. Imperialism as the highest and last stage of capitalism. It is the Soviet belief that pre-monopoly capitalism reached its peak in the *60s and 70s of the 19th century, and was transformed during the period between 1880 and 1910 into monopoly capitalism or imperialism. The current theory of monopoly capitalism is based, in essentials, on Lenin's imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. The most important part of Lenin's book is devoted to the changes that have taken place in the capitalist system since Marx's day. The main points referred to are the increasing replacement of free competition on the market by monopolies, and the frequent extension of these monopolies far beyond national boundaries, and even on a global scale, There is also much said of colonial conquests, the growing export of capital to economically backward countries, and this especially important feature of monopoly capitalism, the steadily increasing fusion of industrial and bank capital. Lenin, however, adorns his tale, in the book and in various articles, with other, more propagandist claims, to the effect that imperialism is a parasitic, decaying or moribund form of capitalism. Despite their obvious inconsistency with the historical facts, these elements of Lenin's theory of imperialism are also dwelt on with a special emphasis in contemporary Soviet ideology. The transition from pre-monopoly capitalism to imperialism was made possible by the concentration of production, and by the rapid evolution of the productive forces. New processes in steel production, better and more productive machines, an unexpected advance in scientific and technical knowledge, coupled with the swift rise of the electrical and chemical industries, all contributed to the triumph of monopoly capitalism in all advanced countries at the beginning of the present century. In Lenin's opinion, which still retains its authority in the Soviet Union today, monopoly capitalism differs from pre-monopoly capitalism in the following 5 respects. 1. The concentration of production and capital developed to such a stage that it creates monopolies which play a decisive role in economic life. The free competition of pre-monopoly capitalism has been replaced by the dominance of monopoly. Through increasing concentration and centralization, it has become possible for a small number of large undertakings to take over a whole industry. The first step was the making of agreements among the few giants concerning prices, sales markets, and programs of production. This provided the impulse to the creation of monopolies. A monopoly is defined as an agreement, alliance, or association between capitalists who concentrate in their hands the production and sale of a substantial part of the production of one or a number of branches, in order to fix high prices for commodities and obtain monopolist high profits. The main forms of monopoly are cartels, syndicates, trusts, and concerns. They combine in their hands enormous economic power, which enables them to dictate monopoly prices and reap monopoly profits. Yet monopolies have not done away with free competition altogether. What remains of this, however, now operates in other forms and at a different level. Within the monopolies we still find competition in the struggle for leading positions within the enterprise, for majority stock holding, and for division of the spoils. In addition to this, monopolies compete with one another, albeit within the framework of their agreements, and that not only in one and the same industry, but also with monopolies in other industries, if the products thereof can be substituted for their own. Finally, a competitive war is also waged between monopolies and non-monopolistic undertakings, 7 cent. Those which do not belong to any monopoly group. The dominance of monopoly leads to a sharpening of the contradictions in capitalism. The socialization of production is accentuated, but the enterprises remain in the private ownership of individual proprietors or capitalist groups. And this deepens still further the basic contradiction of capitalism, between the social character of production and the private form of appropriation. 2. The merging of bank capital with industrial capital, and the creation, on the basis of finance capital, of a financial oligarchy. The concentration of production is accompanied by a similar concentration and centralization of bank capital. A multitude of small banks is replaced by monopolistic bank unions. This access of power has an effect on the relations between the banks and industry. The banks become co-owners of industrial concerns, while monopolistic industrial capital flows, on the other hand, into the banks. Bank and industrial capital combine to form finance capital. This process also finds expression in the frequent personal union of the heads of banking and industrial concerns. Within finance capital, a quite special part is played by the joint stock companies. Here the capitalist or capitalist group that owns a large amount of stock, can also control the capital of the other smaller shareholders. On the basis of this finance capital there arises a financial oligarchy, a small group of big bankers and monopolists, who simultaneously control the major industries and the banks, and occupy the key positions in capitalist countries. 3. The export of capital, which has become extremely important, as distinguished from the export of commodities. Whereas it was typical of pre-monopoly capitalism to export commodities, the primary concern of monopoly capitalism is with the export of capital. The latter is chiefly exported to economically backward countries, where wages, raw materials, and land prices are low, so that the monopoly capital brings in vast additional profits. The export of capital takes two forms: firstly, as direct investment, through the setting up of industrial, trade, and banking concerns abroad; secondly, as loan capital, in the form of loans to governments or private credits. The outflow of capital is not a form of aid to the underdeveloped areas, in Soviet eyes, but one of the bases for the system of imperialist oppression, in which a few rich usurer countries exploit the greater part of the world. Until the First World War, the most important capital exporting countries were Britain, France, and Germany. Already after the First, but especially after the Second World War, the picture altered, and the United States became the leading exporter of capital. The export of capital leads, in Soviet opinion, to intensified rivalry among the great powers, in the struggle for the best return on capital. It is noted as a characteristic phenomenon of recent times that American capital is no longer exported merely to backward countries, but also to old capitalist countries such as Britain, France, and West Germany. 4. The formation of international capitalist monopolies which share the world among themselves. The growing export of capital and the increasing opening up of the world to commerce create the conditions for agreements concluded between the biggest monopolies of various countries on the division of markets, price policy, and the volume of production. In the process, private and government monopolies become intertwined with one another, so that many international monopolies have been formed with the active participation of the states in question. According to Soviet accounts, the number of international monopolies had grown from 40, at the end of the 19th century, to about 100 in 1914. At the outset of the Second World War, there are said to have been more than 300 monopolies of this type. International monopolies are considered by the Soviet authorities to be an expression of contradictions between the various groups, and the states supporting them, and hence of power relationships that are constantly altering. They are therefore unstable in character, and constitute a source of new and inevitable conflicts. 5. The territorial division of the whole world among the greatest capitalist powers is completed. The economic partition of the world by the monopolies corresponded to the territorial division among the capitalist great powers, which took place during the last third of the 19th century. Between 1876 and 1914, virtually the whole of Africa and the greater part of Asia were turned into colonies of the few imperialist states. Yet it is not only the colonies proper that are typical of imperialist rule. There are also the semi-colonial and dependent countries, underdeveloped territories, that is, which, though retaining their formal independence, are yet in a state of complete economic and political dependence on the imperialist powers. Capitalism has grown into a world system of colonial oppression and of the financial strangulation of the overwhelming majority of the population of the world by a handful of advanced countries. By the beginning of the 20th century, the partition of the world was complete. No more free lands remained. A major power could now only acquire colonies and spheres of influence by evicting some other power. The struggle over the division of the world was replaced by a struggle to redivide it. 2. Imperialism as parasitic and decaying capitalism. As already mentioned, Lenin also attempted to show that imperialism was a parasitic and decaying form of capitalism. The development of the economy is hampered by the monopolies, evidences of parasitism become ever more apparent, bourgeois parliamentary democracy is replaced by the dominance of political reaction, and the monopolies dsvenl baroniosks tu vil Lenin opmereproer deliberately create for themselves a privileged stratum of worker aristocrats. Under pre-monopoly capitalism, the entrepreneur could only get the better of his competitors by modernizing his own conditions of production, by lowering his production costs, and by improving his technical equipment. Under monopoly, this incentive to technical progress loses its effect. The result is a tendency to stagnation and decay. The monopolies can maintain their position in the market even without lowering prices, and can put down their competitors by other methods through indirect pressures, financial machinations and so forth. They can even contrive to limit production artificially, in order to extort high prices and profits, and so put a brake on technical progress. In recent years, however, this thesis has been watered down. Whereas in the first edition of Political Economy a whole series of examples was adduced of the decadent character of imperialism, these charges no longer figure in the later textbooks. It is now alleged that stagnation and decay are not to be interpreted as implying a general regression of the productive forces. Even under the conditions of imperialism, the productive forces have continued to develop. It would be a mistake to believe that this tendency to decay precludes the rapid growth of capitalism. It does not. In the epoch of imperialism, certain branches of industry, certain strata of the bourgeoisie and certain countries betray, to a greater or lesser degree, now one and now another of these tendencies. The decadent character of imperialism also shows itself, in Soviet opinion, in a growing parasitism, 1.e, in a significant increase in the class of rentiers, of stockholders, bondholders, and coupon clippers. With the development of the joint stock company, the majority of capitalist entrepreneurs loses its immediate contacts with production. The direction of industry is left to an ever-increasing extent in the hands of salaried managers and technical personnel. The activity of the capitalists no longer consists in directing production, but in the amassing of share portfolios and in speculation. In the political field, imperialism is typified, according to the Soviet authors, by a transition from bourgeois democracy to political reaction. Just as bourgeois democracy corresponds to the capitalism of free competition, so the relations of dominance and subordination under a reactionary regime correspond to the monopoly stage of capitalism. The monopolies that dominate economic life bend the apparatus of government to their purposes, and compel it into a course of political reaction. Political reaction reaches its apogee in fascism, which, on the current definition, represents a terroristic dictatorship of the monopolist bourgeoisie. 1 As the Soviets see it, tendencies towards fascism have appeared since the Second World War in the United States, West Germany, France, and other countries. The militarization of public life, the growing influence of the churches, and racial strife are also adduced as symptoms of this epoch. Political reaction is explained by the Soviet writers on the ground that the capitalist economy is no longer pursuing an upward line of development, and has actually become a brake on the evolution of the productive forces. Reactionary tendencies are due to the sharpening of capitalist contradictions in the epoch of imperialism. The decadent character of imperialism is also evinced in the way the capitalists systematically bribe a section of the skilled workers with higher wages and other inducements, in the hope of setting up this privileged stratum as a counterpoise to the remainder of the working class. The bribes are paid out of super profits, arising chiefly in the colonies. The labor aristocracy is the social basis of opportunism in the working class movement. The opportunists attempt to divert the workers from the class struggle, preach the identity of interests of the workers and the capitalists, and spread the idea that it is sufficient to improve capitalism by reforms. They are thus the agents of the bourgeoisie in the working class movement. Imperialism as moribund capitalism. All the important contradictions in capitalism are sharpened under imperialism. These are, 1. Contradictions between labor and capital, 2. Contradictions between the colonial and semi-colonial peoples and the imperialist powers that exploit them, 3. Contradictions amongst the imperialist powers themselves. The sharpening of contradictions does not mean, however, that capitalism now dies out of its own accord, or automatically collapses, though it does imply that imperialism is the stage of capitalism's development at which proletarian revolution has become really inevitable. 1 Owing, at the same time, to its ever-expanding technical socialization of production, imperialism engenders the material preconditions on which the transition to socialism can proceed, once political power has been achieved and private ownership of the means of production has been replaced by social ownership. This does not, however, take the form of an evolutionary development, but rather that of a revolutionary leap within the historical process. On the strength of their analysis of pre-monopoly capitalism, Marx and Engels were still of the opinion that the revolution would triumph simultaneously everywhere, or at least in the major capitalist countries. However, on the basis of Lenin's theory of imperialism, contemporary Soviet ideology has replaced this belief by the law of uneven economic and political development, whereby the socialist revolution will first be successful only in one or a few countries, and will then spread later on to others. Owing to the competitive struggle under capitalism, uneven development is possible, not only among individual enterprises and industries, but also among capitalist countries as a whole. Thus, under pre-monopoly capitalism, the industrially advanced nations were able to grab the lion's share of the colonial territories. When later new industrial powers grew up and were similarly in need of colonies as markets and sources of raw materials, this necessarily gave rise to worldwide conflicts, from which some powers emerged stronger and others weaker than before. Hence, in the epoch of imperialism, the chain of capitalist countries consisted of stronger and weaker links. Uneven economic development is paralleled also by uneven political development in different states, and the political preconditions of socialist revolution thereby mature in varying fashion from one country to another. Yet the fact that the chain of imperialism has stronger and weaker members offers the militant proletariat the chance of breaking this chain at its weakest points. The revolution cannot therefore prevail simultaneously in all countries. On the contrary, the different countries will take the road to socialism one after another. This law of uneven economic and political development is one of the chief props of the thesis of peaceful coexistence, currently propagated by the Soviet leaders. For if socialism is only to prevail throughout the world in successive stages, it follows that there will be an interval during which socialist and capitalist countries will exist side by side. 7.e. Coexist. Leaving aside this inequality of development, the Soviet view is that capitalism in its imperialist phase is moving into its general crisis. This doctrine still derives from Stalin. At present the general crisis is defined as the all-round crisis of the world capitalist system, involving both economics and politics and also ideology. Unlike the cyclical crises already referred to, the general crisis represents a permanent state of the system. The general crisis began during the First World War, and was sharpened not a little by the resultant excision of the Soviet Union from the capitalist system. It is manifested in wars and revolutions, in the struggle between moribund capitalism and emergent socialism, in the dissolution of the colonial system and the sharpening of the struggle for markets. And not least in the chronic undercapacity working of production plants and persistent mass unemployment. The Soviet belief is that the general crisis extends throughout an entire period of history. It is not a once-and-for-all explosion, but occupies a long period of stormy economic and political upheavals, a period of the collapse of capitalism in its entirety and the birth of socialist society. 4. Criticism. The first aim of the theory of imperialism is to provide evidence that the contradictions of pre-monopoly capitalism have not grown less in the course of time, but sharper and more numerous. More than half a century had elapsed since the publication of Marx's Capital, without the contradictions of capitalism having led to its collapse, or to the arrival of a socialist revolution. On the contrary, during the last third of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th, the economic and social conditions in industrial countries had altered in a number of respects. The state had begun to exert influence on economic life, labor and social legislation had been introduced, and the anti-capitalist forces of the trade unions and workers' parties had gathered strength and come to form a counterpoise. Hence, within the socialist movement itself, there were attempts to revise certain of Marx's theses. It was to counteract these tendencies that Lenin developed his theory of imperialism. This theory, which has become an inseparable constituent of Soviet ideology, gives a more or less accurate conspectus of the changes in the economic aspect of capitalism that had occurred up to that time, the emergence of monopoly, the interlacing of industrial and bank capital, the export of capital, and colonialism. But insofar as the simultaneous growth of counterforces are passed over in silence, a one-sided and tendentious picture results. Lenin, in any case, found the essential elements of his theory ready to his hand. As Walther Thimer observes, he took over his economic analysis of imperialism from an Englishman, J. A. Hobson, who had published an account of the subject in 1905. The notion of finance capital, which plays so large a part in Lenin's theory, had been worked out in 1G10 by the Vienna socialist, Rudolf Hilferding. 1 The allegation that imperialism is a parasitic and decadent form of capitalism is in part quite unfounded and otherwise grossly exaggerated. The contradiction between the supposed decadence of capitalism and its surging economic and technical progress became so impossible to ignore that in 1955 the Soviet ideologue Konstantinov found himself obliged, for the first time, to take note of the fact. So it is now admitted also in the new textbooks, that despite the decadent character of the system, its productive forces continue to develop. Since then, too, the few remarks of Lenin that tell in this direction are again given special emphasis, whereas quotations in the opposite sense are no longer brought into play. The tendency to political reaction on the part of imperialism has made only a transient appearance in certain countries, whereas in the majority of capitalist states the democratic parliamentary system has been reinforced, extended, and developed, and there has been a steady growth in the influence of the workers, and of the less well-to-do sections of the population. The thesis of the labor aristocracy represents an attempt to explain, in terms acceptable to the Soviet ideology, the strength of social democracy and the weakness of the communist parties. The claim that the relative well-being of this privileged stratum has been derived from colonial profits is rendered dubious by the fact that since the loss of their colonial empires, the living conditions of workers in the homelands of the former colonial powers have not deteriorated, but have actually improved. Finally, the Stalinist thesis of the general crisis of capitalism gives the clearest evidence of all of its propagandist character. It is obviously designed to give new assurance to communists outside the Iron Curtain, and within it, to strengthen the hope that the ruin of capitalism will shortly come to pass. The dubiousness of the theses of chronic undercapacity working and chronic mass unemployment is too palpable to require refutation. The failure of these Soviet theses to measure up to reality has become so manifest, that in recent times the Soviet ideologues have been moved to make a few deductions from them. Thus not only has the thesis of the decadence of imperialism been watered down to the point of admitting that the productive forces also develop under imperialism, overboard also has gone Stalin's basic economic law of monopoly capitalism, as formulated by the dead dictator in his last work, Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, the securing of the maximum capitalist profit through the exploitation, ruin, and impoverishment of the majority of the population of the given country. Through the enslavement and systematic robbery of the peoples of other countries, especially backward countries, and, lastly, through wars and militarization of the national economy, which are utilized, for the obtaining of the highest profits. Stalin's allegation of the ruin and impoverishment of the majority of the population of the Western countries seemed to go rather too far even for the most true blue Soviet ideologues, and his thesis of the systematic robbery of the peoples of other countries, especially backward countries, was, with the best will in the world, no longer defensible, once the populations of almost all the old colonial territories had gained their independence. Imperialism at the present day. Tuesday theory of imperialism, and of the general crisis of capitalism has been subject to further development since the Second World War. The general crisis of capitalism is said to have become still more acute, to have entered a new, second stage, and to have acquired various additional features. Moreover, monopoly capitalism has been transformed into state monopoly capitalism. As to the nature and effects of this state monopoly capitalism, there are in fact divided opinions among the Soviet ideologues. In most of their writings up to 1956 and in part so late as 1958 there were merely general references to a further sharpening of class contradictions and exploitation. The discussions in Fundamentals of Marxism-Leninism, which appeared at the end of 1959, give evidence of a first tentative approach to the real problems of modern industrial states in the West, insofar as they take account of the increasing role of the state in the economy, and of the possibilities of lessening the extent of crises, and concede that the workers' living standards have risen. For all that, even the new textbooks still attempt to compress these timid concessions to contemporary reality into the prescribed ideological framework of imperialism and state monopoly capitalism. The second stage of the general crisis of capitalism. Soviet ideology believes that the Second World War, regardless of which states emerged from it the victors and which the defeated, has led to a large-scale abdication of the imperialist system as a whole. The war itself marked the beginning of the second stage of the general crisis of capitalism. The balance of power between the systems of socialism and imperialism has tilted in favor of the former. Before the war, the socialist system existed in only one country, the Soviet Union, which was the home of 8% of the world's population, and which lay surrounded on all sides, like a beleaguered fortress, by hostile capitalist countries. After the war, a number of states in Central and Southeast Europe, and also in Asia, took the road leading to socialism. In place of the previous isolation of the Soviet Union, there is now a socialist camp which possesses everything needed for defense against the aggressive intrigues of imperialist reaction. The socialist camp today embraces over 1,000 million people, which is 35% of the world's population. Thanks to the success of the national movements of liberation and the resultant disintegration of the colonial system, states with a total population of 1,200,000,000 people have freed themselves from the yoke of imperialism. Dozens of former colonial and dependent territories have achieved national independence. This process, too, is regarded in Leninist fashion as signifying a shift of power in favor of socialism. In the last analysis, the outcome of the struggle will be determined by the fact that Russia, India, China, etc., account for the overwhelming majority of the population of the globe. And it is this majority that, during the past few years, has been drawn into the struggle for emancipation with extraordinary rapidity, so that in this respect there cannot be the slightest shadow of a doubt what the final outcome of the world's struggle will be. In this sense, the complete victory of socialism is fully and absolutely assured. The Second World War has also given rise to new contradictions among the imperialist countries. Germany, Japan, and Italy were shattered, from a military point of view, and certain of the victorious capitalist powers, Britain and France, severely weakened. The United States, on the other hand, was able to strengthen its position and assume the uncontested leadership of the capitalist world. Monopolistic circles in the USA are pursuing a policy of economic and political expansion, and are attempting to bring even the old capitalist countries, not excluding their own imperialist allies, under their sway. These contradictions within present-day imperialism are held by the Soviet writers to be due to the sharpening of the main contradiction of capitalism between the social nature of production and the private character of its appropriation. The development of the productive forces calls in increasing measure for emancipation from capitalist private ownership. Owing to the deepening and sharpening of contradictions in the second stage of the general crisis, the monopolies can no longer preserve their dominance by the old methods. This, say the Soviets, is why a new form of capitalist domination has arisen, state monopoly capitalism. 2. State monopoly capitalism. State monopoly capitalism comes about by the direct union of the power of the capitalist monopolies with the enormous power of the state. In this union the state occupies not an independent, but a subordinate position. 1 Monopoly capital utilizes the apparatus of government to gain control of the whole of economic life, so as to ensure itself high monopoly profits and to buttress continually its economic and political dominance. Before the capitalist system entered upon its general crisis, it was still able to do without state support. But since the onset of the general crisis, owing to the severe upheavals caused by the world wars, the world economic crises, and so on, this can no longer be done. In order to ensure the functioning of the machinery of production, finance, and trade, the monopolies have had to combine their power with that of the state. State monopoly capitalism is distinguished, according to the current formulae, by the yoke of monopoly, by militarism, parasitism, crises, and unemployment. The decisive power is concentrated in the hands of the largest monopolies, with the top few hundred richest families exercising a direct or indirect dictatorship. Even the first wave of state monopoly measures during the First World War, especially in Germany, were recognized by Lenin, not as transient phenomena, but as the beginning of an inevitable historical process. Already in 1917 he was talking of the era of the development of monopoly capitalism into state monopoly capitalism. The world economic crisis of 1929-33 did much to hasten the growth of this form of capitalism. Government measures were undertaken to safeguard the big monopolies, and since then such measures for regulating the economy and preventing crises have become the rule. The Second World War accelerated still further the trend to state monopoly capitalism. Under wartime conditions the monopolies became interlinked with the machinery of government, and this formed the framework of the new state monopoly structure after the war. Since then, state monopoly capitalism has taken root in all the major imperialist countries. Present-day state monopoly capitalism exhibits the following features: the machinery of government is increasingly merged with the monopolies, so that eventually the boundaries between them are often no longer discernible. The competitive struggle takes new forms. The big corporations contend for influence over the budget and finances of the state, and for control of individual departments of state. The key positions in government, including the posts of minister, secretary of state and ambassador, are occupied by representatives of big corporations. The state attempts to guide the capitalist economy along particular lines and swells the government budget in order to guarantee the corporations a privileged market, so as to absorb the shocks caused by economic crises. Huge government orders create a state market which accounts for a substantial part of total sales. The state gives large subsidies to the corporations, bids quasi, and especially to those producing commodities of military importance, strategic raw materials, chemicals, and electric power. State ownership increases. The rapid tempo of current progress demands huge investments of capital, which the monopolies leave it to the state to raise. But they themselves take over the construction and equipping of these enterprises, and so make guaranteed profits without any risk whatever. State ownership also grows especially in the armament and associated industries. Unprofitable branches of industry, such as the British coal industry, for example, are taken over by the state, the big capitalists being rewarded with heavy compensation. The nationalist enterprises continue to be run in the interests of private monopoly. The leading positions in the new government concerns are generally staffed in any case by monopolists or their representatives. Various forms of mixed state and private ownership also arise, for example, where the state takes over blocks of shares in different companies. The state and its organs begin to intervene actively in the conflicts between workers and employers. Strikes are settled with growing frequency by compulsory state arbitration in the interests of the monopolies. Other government measures are taken to slow down or even prevent wage increases, while at the same time exploitation of the workers is intensified by rising monopoly prices. State monopoly enterprises are set up on an international basis. The monopolies compel the state to finance commodity exports. Interstate agreements on the distribution and use of raw materials are made in the interests of the monopolies. Particular examples of this are detected by Soviet ideology in the European Free Trade Association and the Common Market. The militarization of the economy proceeds apace. And indeed the chance of rearmament can even lead to a temporary rise in wages. But at the same time rearmament brings about a restriction of production for peaceful purposes, and undermines the basis for extended reproduction, so that the national economy is steadily eroded. The costs are unloaded onto the people through monstrous tax increases, currency devaluation, and neglect of the country's social and cultural welfare. The political consequences of this development are a decline in cultural life, bureaucracy, militarism, and jingoism. The theory of state monopoly capitalism also determines the communist attitude to capitalist nationalization. For the Soviet ideology, nationalization is not simply what it seems. The socialist nationalization carried out under communist leadership after the victory of the proletarian revolution is utterly different from capitalist nationalization, in which property does not pass into public ownership, but remains under the control of the capitalist class. The nationalization schemes put through in the context of capitalism represent a financial operation which in no way disturbs the basis of exploitation, but merely alters its form. Capitalist nationalization alters neither the character of the capitalist system as a whole, nor that of the individual enterprises, since the classes of capitalists and workers remain as before. It is carried through in such a way as to best serve the interests of the monopolies and with least consideration for the demands of the workers. Yet the monopolists are strongly opposed to capitalist nationalization, since it gives evident proof of the fact that a national economy can also get along without capitalists, and since, although the monopolists still have general control of the machinery of government, they cannot completely ensure themselves, after nationalization, against undesirable outside influence and interference. Finally, it should not be forgotten that the state runs the nationalist enterprises solely in the interest of the ruling class as a whole, which does not always coincide in every respect with the aims and endeavors of individual monopolies, combines, and trusts. In countries where state monopoly capitalism prevails, the communists support the demand for progressive nationalization, so long as political circumstances make it futile to insist on complete nationalization. They limit their demands to particular industries, and especially those in which the rule of the monopolies presses so hardly on the worker that he is ready to campaign for immediate nationalization. 3. Economic crises under state monopoly capitalism. State monopoly capitalism makes use of an extensive battery of economic and political measures in order to contend with the devastating cycle of boom and crisis. The most important of these is held to consist in huge government orders to the economy, especially in the field of armaments, so that many monopolies are guaranteed a permanent market. To this may be added the control and regulation of banking, the fixing of interest rates, and in general the whole activity of government in the area of public finance, down to subsidies and premiums for specific economic practices in different branches of industry. Through these and other measures, state monopoly capitalism is able, in Soviet opinion, to influence only the form, sequence, and nature of particular crises. The big monopolies are in a position to utilize the financial power of the state as a sort of shock absorber, so that in many instances the spontaneous outbreak of a crisis is postponed. But the more successful the capitalist state is in preserving the big concerns from bankruptcy, or in mitigating other spontaneous shocks to the economy, the greater the distortion it produces, by its own interference, in the redistribution of capital among the various branches of industry, a process essential to the attaining of economic equilibrium. Policies of this sort cannot eliminate the causes of crises. The diseases of capitalism are merely concealed, and further conditions thereby created for the occurrence of new crises. All that happens under state monopoly capitalism is that economic crises may take on a new form. But as long as the contradiction exists between the social character of production and the capitalist form of appropriation, 7.e, as long as capitalism exists, economic crises will inevitably recur. The absence of crises in Western Europe and the USA since the Second World War is due, so the Soviet writers think, to temporary causes. So long as the destruction of the war had not been made good, there could be no overproduction. Yet once this was attained, grave signs of a new crisis are thought to have made themselves felt. In 1958 there was a cutback of production in Britain, Holland, Norway, and Japan, and an apparent decline of output in West Germany, France, and Italy. In any case, according to the new line of talk, Marxists have never believed that one cycle must parallel another, and that the established periodicity and features of crises are not subject to change. Communists do not rest their hopes on economic crises. They are far from gloating, we are told, over the fact that capitalism has not succeeded in eliminating crises, if only because the bitterest hardship is thereby inflicted on the broad masses of the working people. To be sure, the will to resist capitalism is strengthened by such hardships, but recent history has shown, on the other hand, that the same causes can also promote reaction and the rise of fascism. The task of communist educators is therefore to destroy the unfounded illusions of a crisis-free development of capitalism, and to show that the only chance of abolishing crises is to replace capitalism by socialism. At the same time, communists must support all government measures within the capitalist system which are likely, even in the smallest degree, to improve the conditions of the masses. 4. Class antagonisms under state monopoly capitalism. The Soviet view is that the transition to state monopoly capitalism has the effect of deepening class contradictions. The exploitation of the working class is stepped up, primarily through the intensification of labor, which leads to an accelerated drain upon labor power. Occasional rises in the workers' nominal pay are cancelled again by devaluation and increased taxes, so that in most countries real wages have risen. But little or not at all. And if the value of real wages should indeed have risen in isolated cases, Soviet ideology argues in reply that the value of labor power has also grown out of all proportion, primarily, again, through the intensification of labor, which requires greater outlays for the restoration of labor power. The improvement that has nonetheless occurred in some countries in the workers' living standards is not to be attributed, in Soviet eyes, to any falling off in the tendency to impoverishment, but to the fact that, since the war, conditions have been more favorable to the workers' struggle for their own economic interests. Nor does an improvement in working class conditions imply any lessening of the opposition between labor and capital, for the political antagonisms, the endangering of peace and democracy, have become more acute through the dominance of monopoly. The old and the new middle class. The Soviet view is that a large section of the middle class has been ruined. This is especially true of the small producers, 7e, peasants, craftsmen, and traders. According to Soviet estimates, in 1949–58 the number of small holdings in West Germany fell by 200,000, and in the USA by 1,315,000 in the period 1940–54. This is held to bear out the Marxist thesis that, in accordance with the general law of accumulation, the number of owners of means of production diminishes and the number of wage workers increases. Yet at the same time the development of technology and the extension of political and economic officialdom has multiplied the numbers of office workers, technicians, and scientists, trade and advertising experts, and disseminators of information and culture. But the position even of this constantly enlarging new middle class tends increasingly to deteriorate, because with greater numbers the value of their work diminishes and loses its former privileged character. This seems to the Soviets particularly evident from the salaries of office workers in the USA, whose average income in 1890 was twice that of the average manual worker, but exceeded it in 1920 by only 65% and in 1952 was actually 4% or less. Moreover, the members of this class, including the self-employed, are suffering a steady loss of economic independence. The majority of them work to order as retainers of medium and large industrial concerns, while others are employed directly. Economic subordination is often accompanied by political control, expressed, for example, in so-called loyalty tests. Only a small section of the middle-class higher officials, senior executives of the monopolies, and a privileged group of intellectuals are exempt from this. The change in their economic situation has also caused a shift in the political attitude of the middle classes. Whereas they previously supported the dominance of the capitalist system, they now find themselves increasingly in opposition to the monopolies and so become allies of the working class. The capitalists in the latest Soviet publications, including Fundamentals of Marxism-Leninism, we find notice taken for the first time of the fact that in Western industrial countries the possessing classes are burdened by a number of fiscal and economic measures, such as high progressive income taxes or sizable death duties. It is not considered, however, that these measures have detracted from the power of the capitalists. Formally, indeed, high income taxes run to 50% or more, but they have no practical effect, because the monopolies have found ways and means of circumventing taxes, and because anyway the state has returned these outlays to them through the additional profit on government orders. For the first time, too, we find talk of the managerial revolution. In Soviet opinion, the entrepreneurs have abandoned their last useful function, that of management, to salaried executives. But this has not altered the character of capitalist exploitation, since now as before the real control of production is exercised by the owners, and not by those who merely oversee the process in their name. The only real power is held by top managers, presidents of large corporations, chairmen of boards of directors, etc. These, however, are not managers in the true sense, but really capitalists who receive a portion of the profits in the guise of salary. The one real change that has occurred in recent years is a further stratification within the capitalist class. The big monopolies that have gained control of the government now lord it, not only over society in general, but over the remaining capitalists as well. Even for medium and large-sized entrepreneurs it is becoming ever more difficult to break into the top leadership of combines and trusts. Instead of one group of capitalists alternating with another, as formerly, at the helm of society, there is now an irremovable clique of monopolists, answerable to nobody, and closely linked with and supported by a small circle of managers, bureaucrats, and military leaders. Under these conditions, the small and middle businessmen find themselves in the paradoxical position of being exploiters on the one hand, and yet themselves oppressed by the combines and trusts on the other. State monopoly capitalism thereby leads, not merely to a stratification, but to an actual split in the ranks of the ruling class. On one side stands the all-powerful clique of the monopolists, on the other, the mass of medium and small businessmen. The social basis of monopoly capitalism thus becomes narrower than ever. V. The final rung in the historical ladder of capitalism. From this analysis, Soviet ideology draws the conclusion that all the measures taken by the monopoly capitalists to rescue capitalism do not help to overcome its contradictions, but end, rather, by making them worse and leading to the downfall of the system. Above all, the imperialist camp is no longer able to prevent the constant shift in the balance of power in favor of the socialist camp. This is chiefly shown by the failure of all attempts to weaken this camp. The imperialists have been equally unsuccessful in halting the collapse of their colonial system, and in attempting to repress the class struggle of the workers within their own domains. Finally, despite all the efforts of the capitalist leaders, contradictions are growing in the imperialist camp itself. American imperialism has admittedly succeeded in making alliances with all the big capitalist countries, but with the inevitable development of capitalism, conflicts with the rulers of these other countries are bound to ensue. The greatest difficulties of contemporary monopoly capitalism are thus by no means ended, on the contrary, they still lie ahead. The social character of production demands with increasing insistence the liquidation of private ownership of the means of production, and the replacement of capitalism by socialism. The attempts to outweed history, and to substitute for socialization a prolongation of monopoly rule under the new form of state monopoly, are doomed to failure. The transformation of monopoly into state monopoly capitalism offers no salvation, therefore, to an obsolete system. It means, rather, that the material preconditions for a new socialist order are being created to an ever-increasing extent. The economic processes of contemporary capitalism will make it easier, in Soviet opinion, for the coming socialist transformation to take place. After the seizure of political power, the intended nationalization of monopoly property would make it possible to bring 60 to 70% or more of the means of production into immediate public ownership. In a revolutionary situation, during a revolution, state monopoly capitalism is directly transformed into socialism. 6. Criticism. More than 40 years have elapsed since the publication of Lenin's Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Despite their sharpening contradictions and general crises, the advanced industrial countries have still not thrown off the fetters of capitalism, and the expected revolutions have still not taken place. During the last quarter of a century, revolutionary movements have been successful, by and large, in countries where capitalism had made but little progress. But the advanced industrial countries have no such achievements to show. To account for this phenomenon, the Soviets have meanwhile come forth with the new theses, concerning the second stage of the general crisis of capitalism, state monopoly capitalism, and the final rung in the historical ladder of capitalism. The new theses are the result of an attempt to avoid any serious reappraisal, based on study of the actual facts, and to compress the reality into a preconceived scheme. In so doing, the data in question are coarsened and exaggerated, while inconvenient facts are suppressed or so distorted as to fit them into the dogmatically established pattern. 1. This can be seen with particular clarity in the thesis of the so-called second stage of the general crisis of capitalism. The worldwide confrontation between capitalism and socialism is in general no longer concerned with the economic problems of a capitalist society, but with a contest of power politics between two blocs or alliances, whose origins are primarily political in nature, and in no way founded on the differing economic systems of the groupings in question. 2. The collapse of the colonial system has eliminated one of the features of imperialism to which Lenin drew attention. But the disappearance of this fifth aspect of monopoly capitalism is greeted with no less neglect, in Soviet ideology, than the fact that many, alas, not all of the former colonial peoples achieved their independence without recourse to arms. 3. The claim to see a sharpening of contradictions among the Western industrial countries since the Second World War appears to be a manifest misconstruction of the situation, in view of their ever-increasing cooperation in all areas since the end of the war. 4. The thesis of state monopoly capitalism certainly acknowledges the growing influence of the state in economic affairs, but turns this recognition upside down by maintaining that the power of the state has been subordinated to the monopolies. All government measures against monopolies, and on behalf of the working class, are passed over by the Soviet writers in total silence. 5. The allegation that state ownership in Western countries has been incorporated into the reactionary system of state monopoly capitalism puts Soviet ideology in the awkward and contradictory position of having to explain why, under these circumstances, the communist parties in these countries have been campaigning for nationalization, while the monopolies have been fighting tooth and nail against it. 6. The assertion that the position of employees has progressively worsened is attemptedly proved by the argument that in 1890 an employee received twice the income of a worker, whereas in 1952, in the United States, he got less than the worker's wage. But this would-be proof is a straightforward attempt to mislead, since in fact it is a matter, not of a rapid fall in the salaries of employees, but of a rapid rise in workers' pay. 7. The concluding thesis, that state monopoly capitalism represents the last rung in the historical ladder of capitalism, becomes questionable on recalling that this rung was already supposed to have been reached in 1917. In a few cases, Soviet ideology has of recent years been obliged to make certain concessions to reality, which, however small they may be, would have been unthinkable in Stalin's day. Among these, for example, are the admissions that modern capitalism can restrict crises, that workers' real wages have risen, that the middle classes have not gone under, but that new middle strata have come into being, that the direction of industry has increasingly gone over to salaried management, and that businessmen are now compelled to pay high income taxes and death duties. Yet in all such instances we may still note the endeavor to force these concessions into the preconceived scheme of intensified exploitation and sharpening contradictions. The Soviet ideologists are in a difficult position. On the one hand they have to produce textbooks for the whole international communist movement, and hence, with the best will in the world, are unable completely to get round the objective facts, but are obliged, on the other hand, to keep strictly to the thesis of sharpening contradictions, lest any hope should emerge that capitalism might be able to transform itself into a new kind of economy. Conclusion. Tuesday Marxist-Leninist ideology illustrates how a sound idea may become a lie through overconfidence, and elaboration in terms of an erroneous philosophy. Marx was one of the first to grasp to the full how oppressive and vicious were the social conditions that had arisen in his day through the industrialization of production. Society had split into two classes. The one, very small in numbers, was in exclusive enjoyment of all the amenities that the new discoveries had brought forth. Opposed to it stood the other, comprising the vast mass of workers, who lived in dire poverty, and despite the most strenuous labors, could scarcely earn what was needed to maintain life, the power to work and the means of its restoration. Nor should we pay tribute only to the humanitarian ethic which led Marx to protest against these conditions. No less important was the fact that he was able to work out a telling theoretical analysis of the social relations involved. Marx saw rightly, that the root of this disorder lay in the specific nature of the industrial mode of production, where one party contributes the means of production, and the other the labor power, to a collective economic process. His study of the origins of capitalism had led him to recognize that a change in the mode of production also affects a profound alteration in the structure of society. A further conclusion followed directly from this, namely that if so, the economic factor, the economic life of man, should not be disregarded in the study of history. We have seen in our discussion of individual socio-economic formations how valuable was the impulse furnished by Marx's insight to the historian of antiquity. Marx was not content, however, with a mere empirical investigation of social development. Nor, indeed, is there anything intrinsically objectionable in that. For if we are prepared to grant in general that philosophy has a right to exist, we must further concede that even social life can be studied, not merely empirically, but philosophically as well, and in that case Marx too must be permitted to decide for himself whether he is to study that life in a purely empirical, or also in a philosophical way. The only question that matters in the last instance, is how such a philosophical inquiry into social development is carried out. When Marx applied himself to the elaboration of his materialist conception of history, he had scarcely emancipated himself from Hegel. For all its inversion of Hegelianism, his thought, as we have often had occasion to notice, remained constantly under the spell of that philosophy in important respects. And this ambivalence is one of the main reasons for the defective philosophical treatment of the empirical data he brought to light. It is due, above all, to the effects of Hegelian teaching that Marx supposes a single major law to lie at the bottom of all human history, and the same heritage is equally responsible for his belief that this law of history is dialectical in character. Again, the part played by this Hegelian dialectic of history in the emergence of Marx's conception of classes and the class struggle is certainly no less prominent than his empirical analysis of the current historical facts. Yet if Marx had been really in earnest about setting Hegel right, he would not only have had to invert him, but should also have questioned the monism of the whole Hegelian approach. For if I prove the falsity of Hegel's conception of the relation between idea and nature, whereby the latter is no more than an externalization of the absolute idea, it by no means follows that truth can be attained by a mere inversion of this relationship. It does not follow that nature is the underlying reality, or that the relation of man and nature is dialectical, like that between the idea and nature in Hegel, nor does it follow that the same laws hold, in the field of man's social development in history, as those which govern the evolution of nature, etc. If Marx had not been content with a mere inversion of Hegel, he would have had, in the first place, to approach the reconstruction of philosophy from the same basic question which formed the starting point for Kant, and thus indirectly for the Hegelian synthesis: under what conditions in general can there be universal and necessary knowledge? 1. By what right do I extrapolate from a state of affairs that I have observed only once, to other cases, and permit this to become a universal law? Yet since Marx is content merely to overturn Hegel, he assumes from the outset that there must also be a necessary law in human history, and that this law cannot be other than dialectical. Hence, having arrived on empirical grounds at the conclusion that contemporary social relations are marked by a struggle between labor and capital, Marx was immediately led to infer that at all times and places the history of human society must have been a history of class struggles. And on finding that this social situation had arisen on the basis of a change in the mode of production, it was straightway clear to Marx that in all ages every modification in the social structure must have had its roots in an altered mode of production. But how can generalizations of this sort be justified? Marx and Engels thought to settle the question simply by producing further examples from history. They pointed to the feudal opposition between landlord and serf, and the conflict between slave owners and slaves in antiquity. How little this whole materialist conception of history is indebted to empirical inquiry, and how much it is the product of Hegelian prejudices about the philosophy of history, is clear enough already from the simple fact that this theory of history had shaped itself completely in Marx's mind, long before he had set himself, in his main work, Capital, to discover through the study of economic relationships the internal laws of motion whereby capitalism proceeds to its decline and fall. As Siegfried Landshut tells us, the concern with economic questions was so little to the tastes and true interests of Marx, that he often complained of having to spend himself in such pursuits, and voiced the hope, in 1851, that in 5 weeks he would be rid of all this economic drudgery. Yet these 5 weeks extended to the whole of his remaining lifetime. While Marx was thus busied in furnishing a concrete shape and basis to his philosophy of history from the economic sphere, Engels was working to establish it in another direction, by providing it with a still more extensive generalization. In the 7 Os he devoted much industry to proving that the same dialectical laws of development that Marx had pointed out in the realm of social evolution were also operative in nature. The result of these studies was the dialectics of nature, which marked the moment of gestation for what we now call dialectical materialism, which forms the first part of the Soviet ideology. Where Marx had elevated the circumstances that he could observe in his own day into a universal law of history, Engels now raised them to a still higher level of generality, and turned them into the most general laws of being, that is, into a metaphysic, laws that govern all reality whatsoever, and admit of no refutation by any subsequent experience. The materialist conception of history rested on the notion that economic relations determine the whole of its cultural life. This view now found its counterpart in the basic thesis of Engels' dialectical materialism, whereby matter is primary and consciousness a derivative affair. In Marx's materialist conception, the dynamic element in history was the contradiction between the two main classes in any given social formation, and now Engels too sought to rediscover this situation in nature, claiming that here also the emergence of new and higher forms of being is the product of a struggle of opposites. The outcome of this generalization was thus a system of an astonishingly closed kind, in which everything was deduced a priori from a few initial facts, much as in the multiplication table the whole system can be derived from an initial set of axioms in purely deductive fashion. But it is not sufficient that a system should exhibit such internal closure in order for it to be true. Even if the initial facts proceed from a correct analysis of reality, we still have to see that every further step in the construction of the system is constantly confirmed in practice. The task of philosophy is not to replace experience, but rather, where experience reaches its limit, to try whether we cannot, by inquiring into the conditions of the possibility of what experience teaches, attempt to discover more about the real. It is thus that in the course of our exposition we have continually met points at which, for all its imposing completeness, the Soviet ideology is not in accord with the known facts. To recall only a few of these, however logical it may seem, the Marxian view of history breaks down over the fact that it is certainly not through a sharpening of the class struggle that one form of society has been superseded by another. The slave-owning society was not overthrown by the slaves, but by the barbarian invasions. Feudalism was not destroyed by the oppressed class of bonded peasants, but by the bourgeoisie. In the light of these facts, it is not surprising that the prophecies Marx erected on the basis of his philosophy of history concerning future social developments, should not have been confirmed by the actual course of events. It has turned out that class oppositions have not continually sharpened in the manner he forecast, nor have the middle classes been crushed between the two main factions, but have grown ever stronger with the passage of time. The result of all this was the growth of revisionism, which sought to adapt Marxist theory to the historical facts. The struggle against the various revisionist tendencies gave birth to Marxism-Leninism, which no longer attempts to accommodate the theory to actual historical developments, but endeavors, on the contrary, to bring the course of history into accordance with Marxist theory by the use of force. If history has declined to develop in the manner prescribed by Marx, the endeavor must be made to adapt her to this plan. Hence the explicitly voluntaristic element in Leninism, the great importance that Lenin ascribes to the factor of consciousness. €1. A conscious incursion into the course of history on the part of man. If actual developments have not confirmed Marx's prediction of a steady sharpening of the class struggle, it is necessary to found a centrally constructed and strictly disciplined fighting party, whose task is to explain to the workers where their true interest lies, and to incite them to revolutionary struggle. If the revolution has not triumphed, as Marx predicted, in the highly industrialist countries, then this failure too can be easily corrected by depicting capitalism in the era of imperialism as a chain composed of links of varying strength, capable of being attacked and broken at its weakest point, in some underdeveloped country. Hence, just as slavery was not abolished by the slaves, or feudalism by the serfs, so capitalism too has not been destroyed by the workers. Where a dictatorship of the proletariat has hitherto been established, this has either been the work of the revolutionary intelligentsia, of scions of the bourgeoisie, from whom the workers have first had to derive their own class consciousness, or else it has been achieved, as Soviet ideology itself confesses, in countries still deeply sunk in feudalism, such as Poland and Romania, with the help of the Soviet army. Nor does the closed character of Soviet ideology involve it. Merely in contradiction with reality, on closer acquaintance it turns out in any case to be entirely spurious. In discussing the materialist conception of history, we have already pointed out that its individual constituents, historical materialism, optimism, determinism, economism, and the dialectic of history, by no means necessarily hang together. Thus one might be a historical determinist without being a historical optimist, or a believer in historical economism, holding that economics was the decisive factor in social development, without having to support either a determinist or a dialectical view of history, etc. Nor is the monolithic unity of dialectical and historical materialism in any better case. This unity, as we know, is supposed by the Soviet ideology to be established as follows: just as in historical materialism the mode of production, the material life of society, is regarded as the basis on which its cultural life, or social consciousness, depends, so dialectical materialism regards matter in general as fundamental, and human consciousness as a secondary thing. But the bond thus forged between the two parts of the system proves indeed to be a forgery. For, as we have seen, the material life of society already presupposes the presence of mental activity. Nor does this bond turn out to be a deception merely, it also proves disastrous to the Soviet ideology and lands it in needless difficulties from which there is no way out. The whole problem of how the dialectic can progress further under socialism, if socialism and communism are the final consummation, only arises in all earnestness through the attempt to weld dialectical and historical materialism into a monolithic unity. For if historical materialism had not been chained to its dialectical counterpart, the materialist conception of history might well have been content to postulate a dialectical development for class society alone. It could then have ascribed development under socialism to other factors, such as the new driving forces referred to by Stalin, moral and political unity of the Soviet people, friendship among the peoples of the Soviet Union, and Soviet patriotism. The whole problem of how dialectical development can occur under socialism only arises because dialectical materialism has taken this law, which Marx laid down for the development of Saint-Last society, and turned it into a universal law of being, applicable to all reality whatsoever, and thus compelled to retain its validity even under socialism and communism. And we have seen that in the last resort, Soviet ideology can provide no solution to this problem. But why, then, does Soviet ideology put such unnecessary difficulties in its own way? What prevents it from loosening the bond in question? Would it not do better to discard this whole metaphysic of dialectical materialism, and confine itself to sociological investigation of the facts, on a purely empirical basis? As a mere matter of science, it certainly would do better, and similar advantages would follow from a political point of view. For precisely through its demand that dialectical materialism shall be acknowledged, not only by all party members, but by all men whatsoever who live beneath its sway, it has made itself hated by many within its own borders, and especially among the populations of other countries whom it still seeks to woo. If Soviet communism nonetheless clings so tenaciously to dialectical materialism, the reason is that it is the only thing that unites the various elements of Marxist-Leninist ideology into a complete world picture. Yet it is well aware that it will never succeed anywhere in attaining its political and social ends if it does not succeed in bringing, not only party members, but the whole population, to an acceptance of this unitary worldview. This brings us, however, to the point that makes communism finally unacceptable to those who live in the non-communist portion of the world. When we consider the West free in comparison to the communist East, we do so ultimately in the name of an intellectual freedom which resists any ideology imposed by the state, and makes us insist that, in the light of ultimate questions as to the meaning of human existence, we should be allowed to take personal responsibility for whatever decisions we make. The author, Gustav A Wetter, S.J., was for many years the superior of the Collegium Russicum in Rome, the famed Jesuit institution devoted to the study of East European problems. His dialectical materialism is widely regarded as the standard work on the subject of Soviet ideology.